All right, I'm calling to order the Monday, May 7th, 2018 Planning Commission meeting. Mr. Stoddard, can you please call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mr. Wadiska.
Here.
Mr. Rankin.
Here.
Ms. Hockenberry.
Here.
Ms. Dietz.
Here.
Mr. Stevens.
Here.
Mr. Prentes.
Here.
Mr. Krasner.
Here.
All right. Can I get a motion to adopt this evening's agenda?
So moved. Or did you want to change it or anything?
No, we're back on track.
Okay.
So,
So moved.
all right. So Mr. Stevens seconded and Mrs. Hockenberry made the motion. I don't know what detailed notes we need. All right. Well, the first item we have on the agenda is our speaker series, where we are going to be learning about housing trends from Mrs. Sturvant.
And before she starts, I want to do a little bit of an introduction here. That Lisa Sturdivant is a recognized expert not only within the region but also nationally on demographics and how demographics and housing and economics come together when it comes to urban and regional planning. Lisa has worked previously for Arlington County as a demographer. Then she worked at the George Mason Center, Regional Center. Then she worked for the National Housing Conference. Now she's at ULI. She just got back from their spring meeting in Detroit, I think.
Yep.
And Lisa has offered to come and talk to the Planning Commission tonight about housing specifically in the Washington, D.C. region. And this is the idea of this speaker series tonight is a great lead-in for the work that the Planning Commission has on their work plan to update the city's housing chapter. The idea of building, understanding, and having a conversation before the item is before the Planning Commission for action. And that's really what tonight is all about, is building that conversation.
Well, with that introduction, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. We have started this speaker series in the last year or so to try to get information that can be helpful, sort of on a proactive basis, and understand things that can help us as a commission be better prepared for our upcoming challenges. So I appreciate you taking your time to educate us on what's going on in the D.C. area.
Sure. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks, Paul, for the invitation. I'm going to run through some data, some ideas, some of it sort of quickly, some of it if you find it more interesting in a little more depth. And if, as we have questions, let's have a conversation. If there's other data that you think would be helpful to help as you get gather information for doing the housing element, let me know. But Paul told me to take 15, 20 minutes, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know there's more on the agenda. Some of the data that I'm going to share I pulled together for some other work. So nothing is specific to the City of Falls Church, but it is specific to the Washington, D.C. region. So we can talk about how that may vary here in the city versus in some other places. I heard you work for Fairfax County. I'm also working with Fairfax County on their housing strategic plan right now, just wrapping that work up. So I can talk a little bit about that as well. But these are some of the trends we see, right? And when we look at what's happening in the housing market, both nationally and here in the Washington, D.C. region, changes in growth in the renter population. Renters look different. Residents of single-family homes also look different. Single-family rentals are growing in popularity. Affordability, particularly here in Washington and some other high-cost areas, remains a major concern. And as we think about housing policy, preservation is on more people's minds, in addition to new construction, but preservation is really on a lot of people's minds. And so we think about what will shape the demand for housing, and it's really these three things, right? It's jobs and the types of jobs that are coming to the Washington area. It's demographic factors, the aging of millennials, the aging of baby boomers, and the forgotten generation of Generation X, like myself, who are actually very important to the whole housing ladder, because if we stay put, then there's nowhere for the millennials to go, and there's nowhere for us to move into the baby boomers' homes. And then how state and particularly local policy impacts the ability to create new housing options and also to preserve housing. Very briefly, this shows job growth in the Washington, D.C. area, and just to highlight after the recession in 2009 that we've been facing pretty steady job growth. We average about 45,000 new jobs a year. Most of these folks come from other places to take jobs here. So the question is, are we building enough housing to keep up with the demand for jobs regionally? I do want to make a note. When we talk about the Washington, D.C. region, we just want to wrap our head around what we're talking about. It's a region that extends as far as PG and Montgomery County, but also Frederick and Charles and Calvert County, Maryland. And then it extends out to Fauquier to Warren to Clark to Rappahannock down to Spotsylvania. It's a big region. So we just have to keep that in mind as we're thinking about this. And of course, DC and Arlington, Alexandria, and Falls Church and Fairfax. We have had steady growth here across the region. You can see the numbers over the last 6 years or so. We're seeing home prices. These charts show a month over the year change in average home prices. You can see recently home prices have been up about 4, 5, 6% annually. And again, this is for the region, so obviously the city will vary compared to the greater Washington area. And one of the things we're looking at is how the ability for a first-time home, what the ability is for a first-time home buyer to find housing that they can afford. So the blue bars show the average home price for all housing types, and then it's split out by single-family detached homes, townhomes, and condos. So you can see for Fairfax County, the average home price is about $545, with the average price of, let's say, a townhome of about $422,000. So this is out of reach for a lot of folks who are looking to buy their first home, and there's not an awful lot of inventory in this sort of price range, in Northern Virginia in particular. So what we're seeing then is over time, the homeownership rate has declined in the region and nationally, but you can see the decline in homeownership rate among 25 to 34-year-olds, they're the blue bars, so it's sort of declined in the last 10 years. But the homeownership rate for older folks, like myself, I'm actually even older than this, 35 to 44, but for folks who are Gen Xers has also declined over the last 10 years. So it's been, this generation in particular was hardest hit by the housing market crash. And in fact, the folks who are in their late 30s and 40s are the people who lost the most equity during the housing market downturn. They had bought a home, their first home, and they're the ones that saw their equity decline. And they're the ones that are most likely to have been who have become renters by necessity as opposed to maybe renters by choice, this particular demographic. Rents continue to go up. Average rent, median rent is about $1,500 metro-wide. It includes, again, DC as well as, Prince William and Prince George's counties are all in there. And the number of renters who are cost burdened, that is spending more than 30% of their income or even 50% of their income on rent every month, has increased over time. And you can see that between 2006 and 2016, there's 100,000 more renters who are cost burdened. And the idea that if you spend more than 30% of your income on rent, it's a threshold that suggests that you might not have enough left over for other things like food and healthcare and transportation and medical expenses.
Is this gross income or net income?
It's gross. So it's 30% of gross. That's a great question. So it's 30% of gross. So if you're doing your own math in your head, sort of where you might fall. It does very much depend on how much money you make, as you wouldn't be surprised. But if you are somebody who makes, let's say, between $20,000 and $35,000, you are very likely to face a really hard time finding housing you can afford. That's a childcare worker, right? And a bus driver who are married. That is entry-level administrative personnel. Sorry, we got it working.
All right.
This is this involves a number of folks who might be in retail, restaurant, hospitality, leisure, and tourism, a lot of the service economy that really supports the greater Washington area. So what we're finding is while the challenges have always been great for folks who make lower incomes, this housing affordability is really moving up the income ladder. And so this is an example for Fairfax County that we put together. Typical rent, $1,774. When you do the standard rule of thumb of 30% of your income, you need about $71,000 in income to afford the typical rent. These are data from Fairfax County, starting salary and kind of the trajectory of public service employees. So you would need to work 11 years as a teacher in Fairfax County until you made enough money to afford the typical apartment rental. And so anyway, that's true for workers in the private sector as well. These are the median salaries for private sector workers in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area in 2015. This is data are a little bit older, but so. So we just think about this. We sometimes jump really quickly to housing as sort of an issue for people who are low income, or about federal housing programs, or HUD has to be involved in some way. But the fact of the matter is that increasingly the folks who are working in the economy are having a really hard time finding housing they can afford unless they're at the very high end. We have a dichotomous income distribution here. We have a lot of high income folks, and then we also have folks who are working full-time year-round and are making incomes down in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So we're seeing people leave is one of the implications of this. And you can see this is a little bit of a complicated graph, but the lightest yellow bar shows the change in people who lived here 1 year and moved somewhere else in the United States. So you can see for the past 3 years, those yellow bars have been negative, that more people have left the DC area to move to other places in the US than have come from other places in the US to move here. And the only reason that we've added population is because of international immigration and natural increase, that is births over deaths.
Did you
Please.
look into at all how much of that's related to the industry around here, which is the federal government?
So that's a fair point. So the fact that we have lost jobs in the federal government, but at the same time, we've actually.
Not just lost them, but they
Please.
change all the time. And people come and do a tour and then they're out. And
That's fair. That's fair. Although we don't see this, it's funny, we have seen a little bit of a different effect during this administration change, but we don't see as much turnover in the change of the administration as you might think. It turns out that people who might have worked for, let's say, the Democratic president typically stay in town and go work on K Street, or they go work for a congressman. There isn't as much turnover as you might think every 4 years.
These numbers are net, so this is net of that, right? These numbers are net, so we would
Yeah.
take into account people who were,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, so these are people leaving and coming. Yep. And this is who's leaving, right? And so this shows the change in the population aged 25 to 34. These are the millennials, right? These are the young people, first jobs. Washington and Chicago are the only places who saw this population decline over the 2014 to 2016 period. Even in high-cost places like San Francisco and Seattle, this population has been growing in the last couple of years, and a lot of it has to do with the changing economic structure here in the Washington area, that there's changing opportunities, but it also has to do with some places like Dallas and Houston and Philadelphia and Minneapolis having better housing options and having lower costs of living. And in fact, you can see that here. This is data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and it actually shows the relative cost of living of these other metro areas compared to ours. So Atlanta is 19%, has a 19% lower cost of living than DC, even taking into account lower wages, right? You're gonna get a little bit lower wage when you move to Atlanta, but housing costs are so much lower that the cost of living is. So right, so if you're a young person looking for your job, you're not tied here for any particular reason, why wouldn't you be looking at Atlanta? Or I was just in Detroit, and Detroit is a really interesting place right now, right? There's a lot going on, there's a lot of energy in Detroit. Phoenix, Dallas, Houston, Minneapolis, Chicago, right? There's lots of places where the cost of living is less than here. We're gonna talk about why in a minute. Oh, you guys probably know about why. But there's some other things that are going on. And one of the things that I was asked to talk about at another talk was, if you think about coming out of the housing market downturn, one of the implications, one of the ramifications has been an increase in the number of renters. So, right, people are either, as I suggested, renting by necessity because they lost their home to foreclosure, or maybe they haven't been able to save for a down payment. The mortgage, the credit box was really tight for a while. It was really hard to get a mortgage. There's a lot of renting by choice in the two demographics that are really driving these trends, both the younger millennials and the older baby boomers. And so we see some renting by choice as well. Like I said, I did this for a different presentation, so I have data also for Richmond and Hampton Roads, which is interesting, I suppose. But the shares of people renting, the numbers of people renting are up no matter what age. So the percentage of people who are renting in that 25 to 34, 35 to 44, 13% higher now than it was 10 years ago. So there's a significant increase in the number of people who are renting, again, either by choice or by necessity. Families with children, this has been a big increase. We don't often see that big increase, but there's been a pretty substantial increase across the region in terms of the share of families with children who are renters instead of homeowners. So when we think about the rental housing in the DC metropolitan area, we're seeing kind of a distribution of the types of housing that is rental housing. Again, this is DC metro-wide to keep remind ourselves of that. But about 13% of our rental housing stock is single-family detached homes, and that's been on the rise for since the recession. Our biggest stock is actually small apartment buildings between 5 and 20 units. This is this very important source of affordable housing, oftentimes. Older garden-style apartments maybe don't have the dishwasher, maybe don't have the second bathroom, maybe have really small closets, sort of affordable by market because of the market. But this is what we're getting when we build new, right? So we're getting stuff like this, which this is not a opinion. It's just when we see what new construction we're seeing, very high-end rental construction, both in places like Tyson's as well as in DC. This is places where
In
rents are.
Falls Church.
Falls Church, fair enough, right? So that when you are seeing new construction, and we are seeing new construction, we're seeing it being built at the very high end to meet, remember that barbell demand of income, where, there are people who are demanding those kinds of rents. Although it is moderating, and there's 30,000 apartment units in the pipeline in DC alone. And it just seems to me that we're at a point now where we might be reaching a saturation point on the high end of.
Or the vacancy rates.
The vacancy rates are stable, but so the first indication is there's an increase in concessions, right? Where the property manager are giving 1 month, 2 months, free gym membership, free parking. So you don't even see any change in the rents. They look flat because they report the rent, but you're seeing the concessions uptick. And so the next thing that we'll keep an eye out for is the vacancy rates. Yeah, what will happen to the vacancy rates? So why aren't people buying? One reason is student debt. About 4 in 10 of people age 18 to 29 have student debt. You can see on the right the median amount of debt. It's my opinion that this story about student debt gets a lot more press than it deserves, for lack of a better word. It is an issue, don't get me wrong. But that number of 4 in 10 having student debt, that hasn't changed much over time. What has changed is there's more and more students who have taken out student debt and haven't finished college. So there's a difference between taking on debt that leads to a job that allows it to be easier to pay off, but we're having more and more folks who are taking out debt and not finishing school. And that makes it hard to get the next job up to then be in a position to be a little bit better off economically. Okay, I want to just spend just a minute on the single-family home stock in the DC region. Half of the housing stock, just about, in the greater Washington, DC region are single-family detached homes. About 1 in 5 are townhomes. And then you can see about 33, about a third are apartment buildings. In fact, only 13% of the units region-wide are in these big apartment buildings. But that gets a lot of that's what we see, though, right? That's what's getting built. That's what we see in the paper. That's where a lot of the construction activity has been. It's been in D.C. and in Arlington and maybe here in Falls Church and Silver Spring. But they actually are a pretty small share of the overall housing stock.
You know how that relates to other places in the country? Or?
That's a really good question. I know that the share of rental homes that are single-family detached is higher in Hampton Roads, for example, and in Richmond, just because
Military.
those are the two I looked at. Yeah, and I think that's part of it. I also think it's they're a little bit more suburban in nature, at least Richmond is. I don't know the answer. We can find out. I'm not 100% sure. So who lives in these single-family homes? So back in 2010, like if you looked at the population or look at the sort of stock of single-family homes, it used to be split 15% renters and 85% owners. And now it's split 15.7% and 84%. So it's a slight shift, but there's been a slight shift towards single-family homes being occupied by renters rather than owners, region-wide. Who lives in single-family homes? So the green bars show the heads of household in different, in these very broad age groups. And the big story, I imagine this is true in the city of Falls Church, and I just got done doing a study of housing for older adults in Montgomery County, Maryland. And the aging of the population, and the population in particular of single-family neighborhoods, is, if you look in Montgomery County at least, at the trajectory, it's dramatic. The growth in the population that's currently now in their 40s and 50s, and in the next decade, 60s and 70s, 70s and 80s, and that these single-family neighborhoods are where the vast majority of the older adult population in Montgomery County is living anyway. And there's a sense, again, I'll speak to Montgomery County just since that's what I've been working in recently, that there aren't a lot of options for someone who may want to stay in Montgomery County, right?
You got it.
Right? Who has this big house. Maybe I looked at the data on overhoused which is of course a value judgment, but looked at people who were living in single-family homes where there was one more bedroom than there were people in the homes, just as a way. And it's something like 85% of older adults who live in single-family homes live in overhoused situations. Now, you know, that's, again, no judgment. I mean, maybe thank God the kids are gone. We can bounce around this big house. That's no, but if there's, but if instead they were like, well, gosh, I wish we could, you know, turn part of our house into an apartment, or I wish we could sell and find a condo that was less expensive, or I wish we,
Do it.
right? They can't do it.
Yeah, I'm very much in that
You're
situation.
very in that.
So that's why I'm an expert on that one.
Yeah, well, as you guys think about housing issues, if there's an interest, I'll make sure, Paul, that I let you guys know where to find that in Montgomery County. Now, Montgomery County obviously is a different jurisdiction, but I imagine some of the demographics are similar on that senior housing, older adult housing issue in particular. And then this is the average household size. This is what surprised me. Maybe you guys can tell me if it doesn't surprise you. The average household size has increased over the last 6 years. I thought with all these young people moving in, we would have had the average household size decline, but I think that there's more and more, and we would have to look into this more, there's more and more people who are doubling up and tripling up and quadrupling up and living so that they can afford to live. Even the young people are living.
And do you think in the past, when your kids get older and then they leave home, now they're not leaving home?
No, they're
so
not. That's
these
gotta be part of it,
Households
too.
are staying bigger longer?
It's got to be part of it, right? And so, and it's happening both on the renter side and the owner side, which makes me think there's those two, like you're suggesting, those two dynamics going on. This side might be the, you know, adult children not leaving, and this side might be the group homes, you know, group houses kind of thing.
But I also think we're seeing bigger families.
Well, and then the
Here in
third
Falls
piece is
Church.
immigration.
And
That might not be
Three
what
is
you-
the new, you know, now it's kind of common where two used to be.
Yeah, people keep telling me that 3 is the new 2, but we're stopping it at 2. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there's so yes, I think that people, though, you know, we're hearing conflicting things though, right? Because we also hear that millennials are having children later. And so maybe 3's the new 2 for folks who are in their, you know, late 30s and early 40s, but what's going to happen with the folks who are now in their 20s and early 30s? If they're waiting an extra 5 years to have the first one, it gets harder and harder to have 3, for example. So I think this household size issue, I think, is going to be really interesting to look at when it comes to thinking about housing demand. I know I'm going really fast, but this shows just the distribution of household sizes by, and I do need to clarify, this is single-family homes and townhomes. I couldn't split the data out just for single-family detached this time around, but that actually doesn't change all that much. I think the other one is a little bit more instructive. Okay. So just a word on, you know, this housing affordability, this like difficulty finding housing that people can afford to either buy or to rent. And, you know, it's like there's a lot of reasons, and expensive land and rising construction and labor costs, a really challenging time finding labor to build houses. And then state and local regulations. Working at ULI, I do a lot of work on local zoning and how local zoning can limit the construction of smaller homes and different kinds of homes that might not be typical. And then lastly, community opposition to new housing is really a barrier in many jurisdictions, right? That it delays the process for getting stuff through the review process. It makes it more expensive. There are all sorts of, I mean, I worked on the Arlington Housing Plan, so I know how important community involvement is in the planning process. And it is important to make sure that there's enough opportunity for input to make sure that your community sort of grows in the way that makes the most sense. But there have been more increasing cases of where community opposition is actually derailing entirely or delaying to the point of making it financially impossible to build housing, not only here in Northern Virginia and DC, but, you know, all around the country. And we know that housing serves as a platform for, you know, individual and family well-being, for diverse communities. Gosh, but we also know increasingly that if you have a diverse housing stock, you're actually more economically viable. And if you have seen anything on the Amazon HQ2 stuff, right there in their RFP, it was, tell us, community, about the diversity of your housing stock. Tell us how our workers are going to live in the community. And so this idea that this big economic development push focused on housing affordability and availability, maybe in a way that was visible for kind of the first time, I think, that people thought about it, is, I think, pretty striking. So there's lots of things that communities do to think about ways to expand housing options and to make housing that's affordable to people all along the income spectrum, which many of these you're well familiar with. But I think the biggest challenge that local communities really face, in my experience, in my work, is really the communication piece, right? We all know what the tools are. There's no silver bullet, right? It's just, how do we figure out if there's, if there's information that we need, or if there's an economic argument that we haven't thought about, or whether we need to hear more about how there's a link between economic growth and housing diversity. We know from research that density promotes more housing options. There's a really interesting research paper that shows that if there had been an increase in housing in the most economically productive regions of the country, our GDP would be 9% higher now than it is. So to put that another way, as we came out of the recessions, the place that are adding jobs the fastest didn't add enough housing. If they had, more people would have moved there, and we actually would have had a higher GDP, which is one measure of economic. It's not the end-all be-all, but it's certainly one way to think about how housing relates to economic growth. You guys have heard of Richard Florida. He's big into this sort of measuring when you double density, you actually increase the number and share of jobs in these kinds of idea industries. So just to end, sort of 5 or 6 things as we look forward. It seems to me like there's going to be slower growth in rental housing demand. Millennials in particular are getting older, right? And they're having children, and they're getting married, and they're feeling more economically stable in their jobs, and so they're going to be looking to buy homes. At the same time, the influx of millennials younger workers is slowing, and there's a glut of high-end rental construction, so that seems to me a place for slowdowns, increasing vacancy rates, like you said, softening of rents. I think this conversion of single-family detached that we've seen shift to rental over the last few years, I think it's going to go back the other way. You've been holding on to that single-family detached home as a rental, and now all of a sudden you're seeing home prices back up. You might put it back on the market and lose that from the rental stock. I think this loss of small garden apartments from the stock, as you all, I'm sure, are well aware, Arlington County is really focusing on this right now, the naturally occurring garden apartment stock, and how to stem some of the loss, and all communities are looking at that. And then this idea of new different models for housing, this idea of tri and fourplexes, accessory units that might fit with the character of single-family neighborhoods but require a different way of thinking about zoning and planning is really sort of where some of this stuff is going as well. Despite the desire for homeownership, there'll be continued obstacles. I think lack of inventory is the biggest one on this one, honestly. I don't think interest rates are going to be, if you want to buy a home, you're going to buy a home. The prices will adjust for the interest rate increase, which has been modest. The tax environment for homeownership, there's a whole thing about, how you can't deduct as much on the
Yeah, how's that going to
taxes and-
affect things?
I think, have you guys heard what New Jersey's doing? There's like these workarounds, but I think people are going to figure it out. I think we're going to figure it out here. We're smart here in the Washington. We'll figure it out.
Governments as charities.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I get it. I just don't think it's going to be a particular obstacle. Strong suburban housing demand, despite the sort of back to the city movement, it feels to me like there's more housing options, particularly in the suburbs. The close-in suburbs like Falls Church, I lived in Delray for a while. Those kinds of Falls Church neighborhoods, South Arlington neighborhoods, those are very in demand, and at some point people are going to keep moving out because there's just not enough housing, right, to accommodate folks in those inner areas. I think continued out-migration from the region as we compete with other places for workers. And then, look, affordability challenge is going to continue. It's been on the rise. It is not, there's no end in sight. Wages are going up very slowly. The good news is wages are going up for people at the lower end faster than they have in a really long time. That's a good thing. But it does seem like this barrier to producing and preserving housing that's lower cost is going to continue to be a struggle. I went like 7 minutes over my 20 minutes, so I'm sorry, but I had way too many slides, but
I thought it was
the
really
flavor
Yeah.
of some stuff.
No problem. Well, thank you.
Sure.
Do we have, let me first turn it over to you guys. Do you have any questions you want to ask specifically?
Now, do you see condos coming back?
So, it's interesting. I had an interesting. I was at ULI and had an interesting conversation because someone said, well, condominiums are a really important source of home ownership for young millennials, right? There's this idea of, and so why aren't we seeing them built? And so there's two things that we talked about. The first is financing for building condominiums, from what I understand, is still challenging. Like if you're a builder and want to build a condominium, it's hard to get a bank to say, yeah, I'll go in on condos because of some perceived risks associated with condos still. But secondly, there's interesting survey data that suggests basically that younger adults don't want to buy a condo. They would rather rent. Now, it depends on what survey you're looking at. They would rather rent a single-family detached home at this point than buy a condo. So it's not about the home ownership, but rather about the space and the yard. And so, again, it depends on whose survey you're looking at, but this demand for condominiums, which is what I thought would be super strong now, someone's saying, no, that's not really what they want. They would rather trade off the equity building and have the space. I don't know.
But if the most expensive housing is like around the metro stations,
Yeah.
isn't that an indicator of market demand?
Oh, for sure. Oh, no, yeah, don't get me wrong. We'll never have enough housing next to the metros to meet demand. But I guess the trade-off would be, the question is, would someone trade off 900 square feet in a condo near the metro, right, versus, let's say, 1,500 square feet further out in Fairfax? And someone might say, oh, well, of course they're going to do the metro accessible. Everyone's in the metro. But I'm not so sure that's true. I think this space draw, commutes have been going up every single year. Everyone keeps saying we can't keep commuting, but we keep doing it. So I think there's for sure a need for more housing options near metro. It seems to me like condominiums near metro will meet a certain segment of the demand, but I don't think it's the end-all be-all for the millennial generation, which is not what you were saying either. But
You'd also mentioned that household size is going up.
yeah,
Do you know about household formation? Is that changing? Are we seeing more? You mentioned that maybe it's people doubling up, singles
Right.
doubling up together.
yeah.
Are there more families with kids?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that specifically. So we know there's more renters who are families with kids, and we know that millennials, folks in their 20s and 30s, are having kids and getting married later. I'd have to check on the household formation rates or the family formation rates. So yeah, that's a good question. Certainly something I can check into. Yeah, that's a good question.
Or
2016. So yeah, good. ACS hopefully will come out with 2017 data anytime.
when you mentioned the like the smaller, older garden apartments
Yeah.
and affordable housing, I think that's totally true. How can governments prevent their redevelopment? I mean, as a landowner, I own this thing, it's old,
Sure.
I could double, triple, quadruple my money if I redevelop it. What could we realistically do? Because that's our biggest stock of affordable housing is
Sure.
just old apartments.
So, the first thing, it's a great question. And the first thing I would say is I would watch what Arlington's doing very carefully. Because I don't think they figured it out yet, but they're spending a lot of resources trying to figure it out. And so to the extent that we can learn from each other, we should certainly do that. But there's sort of three basic kind of avenues that, sort of people think about. The first is sort of, are there ways to incentivize current property owners to maintain their properties at a lower rent through tax exemptions, tax abatements, sort of favorable tax status? Virginia, it's sort of iffy which ones you can use and which ones you can't. So you sort of have to, and then there's often property owners who are saying, yeah, great, give me the exemption or abatement, but don't make me sign anything that makes me have to check income. And, I don't want to be in the regulated housing game. So that's tricky. The second is, communities are pooling their money and using public money in collaboration with private sector and nonprofit sector investors and buying it and getting it under local control or getting it under nonprofit control. And then the third thing is if you look at sort of smaller garden apartments that might be sort of close to their end of life or like needing serious rehab, then communities are looking at whether those are sites where an increase in density makes sense, and you then do an increase in density in exchange for a certain share of the new housing to be reserved at levels that are affordable to folks who have lower incomes.
I think, Falls Church is interesting. It's interesting to see the demographics and the statistics because we're so small and sort of unique
Yeah.
that a lot of it's sort of like, well, that's not
For
gonna
sure.
apply here. Although it would be interesting to carefully study it because you could literally count everything.
For sure.
And it'd be fun. But I think a big challenge we have is we have this huge demand for our school system.
Yeah.
And so any housing that we provide that can house families with school kids is very expensive, not just to build it, but now we have to teach those kids, and that drives up our taxes and makes everything else less affordable. And we don't have, like Arlington, they have a big, commercial base. They need
Yeah.
workers. So they might say, well, we can take on more school kids because our businesses need the workers. We don't have that. So we're in this tough spot where, and it's interesting because we do have a lot of resistance to our apartments, but our apartments, the expensive high-end apartments,
Sure.
bring in a lot of people spending money, increase the value of that land, and don't bring that many school kids.
Yeah.
So right now, for us, it's, in my opinion, it's kind of our only game towards that, other than trying to get some money and buy an older building, keep
Yeah.
it going. But because if we basically said, hey, let's build more townhouses, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
We'd get a lot of school kids, our taxes would go up even more, people would complain even more how unaffordable everything is, and so it's a balancing thing, and.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think, I'm, just because, it's not just because I'm a researcher that I'm saying this, but I think, the first step is really understanding what those links are, right? That everyone can sort of have the right information, because I do think that sometimes we make decisions, I'm not suggesting you all do, but make decisions on what we think we know is true versus what has been true, especially when things are changing so much right now. And so that would be, and then bringing that data and that information to light, right? Shining light on the stuff we know and not being afraid if we're putting stuff out there that might give fuel to some people's fire, as long as we're all starting with the same information. Because I think there's, so I think there's been a lot of concerns. It's a little bit of an opposite problem of what you're saying. In communities that I've worked with where they're building apartment buildings and they're worried they're going to bring in a whole bunch of school kids who are going to need a lot of help in schools. That's the big thing. You put up apartment buildings, you're going to have folks with, and it turns out that in this particular community, they built this relatively high-end apartment complex, and there was something like one school kid in the whole 200 unit. I mean, I think I even heard a story in Falls Church similar to that as
Yeah,
well.
no, we have all the data,
Sure.
and that's where the
Exactly.
data shows.
Fair enough,
If we
yeah.
build an apartment building that has 3-bedroom apartments, we get a whole bunch of kids.
Yeah.
If it has 1-bedroom apartments, we don't get that many.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
but we know, I mean, I don't know, I think we could all, if we build a bunch of townhouses, we'd get a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And it's just, we don't have a lot of room to absorb them, and they're expensive, and I personally, it's fine with me, but then the taxes have to go up because you gotta teach them.
Yeah, the
so.
fiscal issue, yeah, for sure.
If I could, Lisa, you talked about affordable housing, but you also talked earlier on about middle income earners also struggling to afford housing costs, especially starting housing costs. Have people been talking about affordable housing, workforce housing, and how does that relate to percentages of AMI? So are people starting to plan for brackets of 60% AMI, 80%, 100%, 120%
Yeah.
AMI? What are people protecting with affordable and workforce housing requirements?
Yeah, so this workforce housing term is a little tricky, but in general, and so I was very careful, but you can tell me if I slipped, that I almost never say the words affordable housing. I might have said housing affordability, housing affordable to people all along the income spectrum, because affordable housing tends to trigger something in folks. But the fact of the matter is we all need housing that we can afford, right? So this idea of housing affordability. But capital A, housing affordability, typically involves housing that's affordable to people up to 60% of area median income, because it typically involves a subsidy either from the federal government or the local or state government, and that's the limit that the federal or state government sort of goes to. So this is folks make, the AMI for the region for a family of 4 is $110,000. So this is a family of 4 making $65,000 would be low income, which is crazy to me in some ways, right?
That's what our figures are, yeah.
Yeah, and that's true for the broader region. And so then after that, communities are increasingly saying, well, we know about these programs that help folks up to 60% AMI, but we're seeing folks at, above that, at 70, at 80, at 90 having a hard time, and there's no federal money. There's no state money. There's no money, right? So what can we do to help increase housing options for people who might be at 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, in Tyson's Corner up to 120% of area median income. So in the new Tyson's plan, there's a requirement to, and you can correct me if I get it wrong, but there's a incentive to increase the amount of housing you can build, and in exchange for that increased density, you have to include housing that's affordable at different tiers. And those tiers go up to 120% of area median income, which suggests that someone thinks that Tyson's can't build market rate housing, like folks in Tyson's can't build market rate housing at a level that's affordable to 120% AMI. Of course, when we talk to developers, they say we can indeed build it at market, and we don't want to go through the program to do that. But, so the long answer / short answer to your question is, for sure. I just got a call from Honolulu, and they want to develop a program that provides resources and increased density to build up to 140% of area median income.
You got to go on site to consult for that. I think.
Well, that's what I said. They keep calling me. I'm like,
Ow.
when are you going to pay me to come out? But no.
Does
But
the
Volcano calms down.
Does the the graduating rates for income levels, does that also account for increasing assets? That is there any sort of interplay between asset limitations on qualifying for these different guaranteed housing programs and being able to save up for a down payment if you want to build a house?
So under the federal programs, there is no asset limit. So there's no income. There's an income limit, right? But they don't check and see if you
Have a trust.
have another trust or have another home somewhere. I don't think. The thing about doing these programs above 60% AMI when you're working within your local regulatory framework or even with your local resources is you set the rules. If you want to do an asset test, you do an asset test. If you want to decide that, look, if you own 3 cars, you need to sell a car before we can decide if you want to be eligible for this housing, then that's what we get to do. One trick, and the car issue is, I've never heard anyone do that. But what people do is they do residency and work requirements. So they say, look, you're at 80, 90, 100% AMI. We're going to create opportunities for more housing that's affordable in that range, but we're going to give preference to city residents or to city workers.
Yeah, I've always felt like incentives to get people to live near where they work
Yeah.
are the best money you could spend. I don't see them that much, but
Yeah.
because it's traffic, it's environmental, it's all kinds of stuff is way better.
Absolutely. Well, we just found, though, with the last project down at Harris Teeter, the Rushmont project, that 100% AMI, they could not rent them.
Meaning they couldn't find people who wanted
Qualified.
who qualified.
So the whole thing is now to go 60% and get a spread, not the single, from studios and 2 bedrooms, no 1 bedrooms, because that's where our needs are.
I see,
So
I see.
the Housing Commission is looking at that.
I see. That's
And
really
but
interesting.
the 100%ers, they could not rent them.
That's really interesting.
And so they had to go in and do some negotiations on it.
Well, and I think that's what a lot of communities find is there's this sense that there's an understanding of where the need is, but then when you go out there, you find out, well, gosh, that's not it's not lining up with the market at all, and you find yourself in that kind of situation. having to-
So the 60% is really necessary
Huge need.
guideline, and possibly even 50% around here. It's really,
Yeah, and you saw the graph I showed with the cost burden, and while it is true at $70,000 and $80,000 and $90,000, it is very challenging at $40,000, even $50,000, which is that 60% AMI. Yeah, for sure.
So it's not really a great formed question, but I'm trying to understand the takeaway for Falls Church.
Okay. Yeah.
We have potentially a bunch of new housing coming in right by a metro.
Okay.
So that's very much in the forefront. We have additional housing that we've not formally approved site plan, but it's well on its way in our sort of city center. And we have all these unique demographics, as we sort of indicated, both in terms of wealth and education and access to whether it be metro or just in general, it's a place that's desirable for people to live in. So as a takeaway in terms of how we're planning for the future, in terms of different housing stock, it seems that in general, diversity of housing stock is good, but it's not offset, but in consideration is that whatever we seem to build, the demand seems to be relatively high. I mean, this affordable housing is its sort of own entity, but we're generating interest in the high-end residential apartment buildings. If there's a lot open or even a house probably out that medium range, they're getting raised and bigger ones are being built. So it's this sort of unique community that has all these wonderful demographics. And so as planning commissioners who are thinking about the housing chapter in our plan, our comp plan,
Yeah.
do you have any sort of recommendations on how to marry all those factors into something that we should be focusing on or
I
thinking about?
I know exactly what you're saying. I mean, there are market forces that are far beyond the boundaries of the city of Falls Church that will affect demand for housing. So coupled with all the things you said about the amenities within the city, you just have this you're a relatively small community in a metro of 4 million people, right? And so people can live and work in lots of different places. And so this is not the answer, but I'm going to start with this anyway. But the extent to which all of the local communities do their planning by themselves leads to this situation all the time, right? And so I was working in the city of Rockville, which is it's similar in some ways. They don't have their own school system, so it's a little bit different. But and they're like, look, we'll do what we can, but the forces of demand for housing in Rockville from the rest of Montgomery County, not to mention the region, are just far beyond what us as local policymakers feel like we can contend with. And so, I think the question is, my advice to local communities whenever they start this is sort of start with the data, start with what, the things you already know, and then think about what the principles are that are going to guide the kind of community that you want to be. Right? So you're going to have two things. You're going to have data, and you're going to have the fiscal impacts, and then you're going to think about sort of how you want to proceed. And then there are ways that you can design for housing diversity that's consistent with those principles. So I guess one of the things I'm getting at is things like, if you think about the single-family neighborhood issue and the tear-down issue, are there ways to think about whether maintaining the character of single-family neighborhoods is a principle or a value, or maintaining something about the structure of single-family neighborhoods is a value? Is there still a way to diversify housing types even by holding on to that principle, by allowing for homes that are single-family to be split into two? So they look like the same from the outside, but the inside houses double the families that they did before. So I think that's not a very good answer because it was a little bit rambling, but since
That was my
since your
question.
question was rambling, I felt like I could ramble too. But I think it's a hard one when you're a small community and you have the pressures from housing from all sides. Because you're exactly right. You build more housing and folks are going to want to be here. It's not like, but the alternative is if you don't build more housing, it's not like the people aren't going to want to be here. It's gonna and so then you have a question of what happens to folks who try and be here and are either homeless or are living in really crappy conditions or are living really, really overcrowded. What happens then when those kids are trying to go to school every day and they're waking up because they had to share a bedroom with four? There are ramifications that are harder to walk through, but they may be there as well. So I don't know. That was I'd love to think about it some more though and come back and talk.
I think we're a
with you
unique
guys.
community, and so I think
Yeah.
that's what sort of what we're grappling with
Yeah.
is the uniqueness of it, and our school system is a huge driver of that.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I get it.
so we're going to be assessing that. We're potentially thinking about some over 55 housing,
Yep.
age 55
Yep,
housing.
there's huge demand for that for sure.
And just trying to make all those mixes and try to better the community in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
Some of this feels like questions of planning at the edges, that when you're in Arlington and you're planning for the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, well, that's easy enough because not only do they control the Roslyn-Ballston
Right.
corridor, but everything within
Fair
2
enough.
miles
Right.
of it. Same thing for Tyson's. Fairfax
Right.
County controls everything within
Right.
2 miles of Tyson's Corner. But in Falls Church, there's Falls Church of 14,000 people, and then there's Greater Falls Church of
Right.
100,000 people.
Right, right.
So when the question of planning for housing in Falls Church City comes up, how do you account for we're planning in the core, but we don't control necessarily what happens around?
Very true.
Talk to your Fairfax County
Well, and some would
folks.
argue that, right, I agree, and some might argue, and I don't know how popular it is or not, that, you step right over our boundary in Seven Corners, and there's a lot of affordable housing.
Right,
Just
fair
a
enough.
stone's throw, or it's just an arbitrary political boundary, and there's a lot, so how much what's our fair share, which is a New Jersey term, what's our fair share of affordable housing that, we need to provide for the region based on, our size and scale? I mean,
And how do we work with other people on it?
right, it's a
which
fair
we
thing to look
really
at.
are
I
not.
mean, I think we certainly should be providing some.
Well, and I think from my perspective, because that's totally true. I've said that for a while. When we say Falls Church, the city of Falls Church, how much affordable housing do we have? And it's hardly any. But you don't have to go too far out until there's some.
Just over the line. I mean,
But
over there.
I actually think one of the values for me, anyway, as a parent, to having affordable housing in the city is because then those kids actually go to school with my
Yes,
kids,
which
and
is
these
why
kids that
we
live
have some
outside
variety,
don't.
yeah.
And so, that's to me a driving force is to actually get a more diverse community.
That's really
and it's hard
important.
to
My
do.
question is, do
Right.
we actually know how far off we are? Because, I mean, we do have the Fields, we do have garden-style apartments, we do have Virginia Village, we do have Merrill House, which the rents
But,
are
like,
not that,
I
are
think-
pretty modest.
Almost everything you mentioned is on its way out, right?
Well, but so
That's
is
the
seven.
scary thing,
But
right?
also, so is Seven Corners.
That's true.
Most of that housing
Changing
is
now.
slated to go. I don't think in that Seven Corners plan any of that housing exists.
Right, I mean, that's a long term.
The market, yeah,
Maybe over
market's
40,
not
50
quite
years,
there,
but
yeah.
Well, but
not
I
going
mean,
anywhere so soon. I think
the same thing
field
with
is
Virginia
much- is much
Village.
more-
There is no
Yeah.
plan on the ground right
No,
now.
but like some of, I mean, we know.
The Square doesn't have any plans.
But we know like Merrill House wants to do something, and
And then the apartment building and condo building on my end of town, the Roosevelt and the Madison, they're not that expensive because they're older buildings, and they don't seem to be going anywhere either.
But they're still not the official affordable, the Fields is our only one.
Right, no, that's our only field, but I mean, Virginia Village is definitely affordable.
Another question I had, something you were talking about is the cost of delay. That when a developer starts having a conversation, can they actually afford to make it all the way through the approval process
Yeah.
before they run out of money to build the project?
Or, yeah, something
Is-
like that, yeah.
Well, you only put so much money in before you got to decide, should I keep going with this approval process or not? Is ULI looking at cost of delay and?
See the note about this? Are you planting a question here? So
I did not.
ULI Washington has just kicked off a study, and the title of it is something like "The Cost of Regulatory Delay in the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Area, Case Studies from 5 Jurisdictions," or something like that. And what it's going to do is attempt to quantify not only impact fees and proffers and other things associated with new residential construction, but also whether you can value the time cost of delay, or in terms of lawyer fees or public meeting time or resubmittals and redesign, those kinds of things. And they're going to try and look at case studies from around the region.
It's like a developer-funded study.
That's right. Well, it's ULI. It's information. It's information. So you take it with a grain of
Depends
salt.
what side of the table you're sitting
take-
on. Whether it's a
absolutely.
delay or whether it's community input
That's
and
a-
review.
that is a fair
and
point.
Substantive improvement.
For sure, for sure. And so, to your point, that's exactly right. It is coming from ULI, but it is going to attempt to at least tell the story from a case study perspective. And if they miss the benefit side, then you got to get in there and say, but wait a minute, we also got X, Y, and Z because of
For
that.
developer, it's never fast enough. It'll never be fast enough.
It is, yes.
They have to come in at all.
And then, but
It's too long.
and I have to stand up for ULI just a little bit because nothing would get built without the builder. So we also have to take care because we want housing just generally. We want housing that's affordable, but we also just kind of need housing more generally. And so if we don't build it, the problem's going to get worse just generally.
I didn't build my own house; someone else built it, and I paid them. And it's fair that they built it in 1938, but
Lightweight.
it's fair that they should get compensated for their work.
Yeah, so anyway, so keep an eye out for that. They've just kicked it off, and it's due sort of at the end of the year to be kind of a done deal.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, well, I appreciate it very
Yeah,
much.
please, and you have my contact information if, you think of a question in the middle of the day, and I was going to say night, but don't call me in the middle of the day. You send me an email, but don't, I'd be happy to reply. And so, Paul, I'll be back in touch with you if there's other data or information that would
Absolutely.
be helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next agenda item. Did we get any receipt of petitions, Ms. G?
I have none.
Okay. There's no old business, so we're going to move right into the new business, which is the comprehensive plan update on the natural resources chapter. And I believe Ms. Walker is going to kick it off here for us.
Yes, Kate Walker, a member of the city staff. She is the city's environmental programs coordinator. And there is in your packet a staff memo that provides an introduction to this item, as well as attachments including the existing natural resources chapter of the City of Falls, for the City of Falls Church's comp plan. And I believe also a student study that was completed by a Virginia Tech studio class. They did make a presentation to the Planning Commission, I believe either in late 2016 or early 2017. So those materials are before you, but I don't want to take away the presentation, so I'll turn it over to Kate.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kate Walker. I'm the city's environmental programs coordinator. Backed up, I might mention, by the chair of the Environmental Sustainability Council, Corey Firestone Weiss. Perhaps before I leap into the natural resources chapter, I will mention that I live in naturally occurring affordable housing. I have a 7.5 minute walk to work. I've lived in the city for 14 years, and it's great when people ask me that DC question, what do you do? I can say, my job is to make the place I live in a better place to live in, which I love. So I'm really excited to be able to kick off this new chapter, revised chapter of the comprehensive plan. You know, the natural resources and environment chapter hasn't been updated since 2005, and things have changed quite a bit. A lot. It's really important to me that in the vision that the City Council worked on last year, they committed to a vision of environmental leadership, and I think we can all agree that the City of Falls Church has already demonstrated that. But that doesn't mean we can sit back and say, we're there, everything's done. There's a lot of things that we need to be committed to. We need to set some policy and some goals and establish our priorities to achieve a vision. And Paul keeps having to remind me that while I can take personal ownership for the project of getting this done, it's not about me. I hate that. This is about a community conversation. This is about setting citywide goals, even regional goals. You know, how are we going to commit to supporting the goals of the region? How are we going to commit to supporting the goals of the nation? How are we going to commit to supporting the goals of the world? As well as how do we keep Falls Church such a wonderful place to live? The old chapter addresses some very fundamental concepts in natural resources: geography, geology, air quality, waterways, flora and fauna, and it does it from a very defensive stance, and I think that was very appropriate to the time it was written, that the concept was, we have these things, we need to protect them, we need to improve them. But I think we need to go beyond that, beyond defense, and say, what can these things do for us? So, you know, when we see a tree and well, there's a lot of tree huggers here in Falls Church, I'm one of them. But why do I hug trees? Not just because they're beautiful, they are also relatively inexpensive: air and water cleaning, carbon sequestering, air conditioning, stormwater pumps whose capacity increases over time without us doing very much. So I think incorporating natural resources into the planning and development process, rather than seeing them as, you know, you can't, as barriers to planning or barriers to development. They're not. They can be part of it. They can support smart growth. They have enormous economic value as well as health and environmental benefits. There are a couple of things in the old chapter that were missed out. One sort of baffled me: waste management. So managing our trash and recycling, and now compost, was not part of the natural resources and environment
We didn't get
chapter.
going on it until about '06, right? When we were on that big committee forever?
Yeah, it was like 06.
And then,
07.
I mean, when we were talking single stream, that was like way in the future. And that we had just really started it and had our own city services take care of it. So it was very, very new when that chapter was written. Practically brand new.
But I do think that solid waste management has a significant environmental component. Obviously, it's a pollution issue as well as a greenhouse gas emissions issue. Not perhaps so much the way we dispose of the trash, but picking it up and carrying it away. Getting down to zero waste will reduce the number of trucks that we have running around the city. So,
And it seems like, at least what I'm hearing, there's more and more of a struggle to use the recycled material that we're gathering and sending off.
Absolutely.
And that some of it now is not being recycled,
Right.
and we don't, you know, maybe it's being burnt now or whatever. So, I mean, it kind of makes me wonder if, like, we were so recycle, and for years and years, and it was a really big push, and a big push in the schools to have the kids go home, especially with Operation Earthwatch, and make their parents recycle, and it worked really well. It made us recycle, but I wonder if we need to move on and be more about reduce and reuse, and and keep the recycle high. But we really need reduce now because, as far as I know, I think a lot of the plastics we're gathering up now are not being used, and so a lot of the glass is not as well.
Secondary markets have dried up.
Yeah, they
Absolutely,
dry up.
and the market is so variable that you can't predict what's going to happen in 2 months' time, 3 months' time. So, yes, absolutely, it's not recycle, recycle, recycle. It's reduce, reuse, recycle for a reason, and reduce is the really important part of that. So, it is almost coincidental. Our solid waste management contract is up for renewal, so I think it really should be part of this chapter. Where are we going to take this in the next 5 years? Our solid waste coordinator, Chris McGow, is very interested in moving towards zero waste, and I certainly would like to see that in this. So let's find out what the community thinks about that concept and whether it should be part of the plan.
Are jurisdictions in Virginia allowed to put caps on household waste? What can be collected?
I don't know. I know that our own system where we have
Very
a
high
little
backyard.
bit of pay as you throw, where you had to
Right.
pay for the size of trash can you had originally, is quite radical for this area.
It was a big deal. It was a
Yeah,
big deal.
People were not very happy about it. But there was a time where there were some houses you go in front of them and they had like 3 or 4 trash cans. And so bringing that in stopped that. And it turned out a lot of the times what was happening is people had a home business. And so that trash was actually not home-based trash. It was actually business trash.
Imported trash.
Well, or their business within their home, and so like there was someone who would have like container after container of shredded paper from their business, which at least it was paper, but still, it's actually, we're not supposed to be picking up business trash.
There are other aspects of waste management that don't get talked about much, but the sewers are actually rather important too, and we're relining ours as we go along. But as the city develops and gets denser, we need to make sure that we can still cope with the amount of waste we're generating and look at ways that can be planned for in development. It doesn't just evaporate. It goes somewhere.
What's Darlington?
It goes downhill, I
Yeah,
believe.
Darlington.
No, I was looking at that chapter and just thinking, my gosh, how, much things have changed since '05.
Well, and the big thing is that chapter didn't address climate change. So I think that is something that we need to take on board in this chapter too, both in terms of mitigation, what can we do to reduce our impact on the climate. It will help us with our air quality goals. It will help us, it's part of our traffic congestion goals too, but also adaptation. The climate is changing, and we need to be ready for it, ready to cope with that. So I think those 2 topics are really important to add to the chapter. As far as timing goes, Paul set me some ambitious goals here. I haven't rejected them yet, but
to paraphrase a council member, it's going to be a city that gets things done. So I think we've had success on the recent comprehensive plan updates because we have really enforced that 9-month goal and a 12-month limit. That outside of that time frame, it's really going beyond the scope of simply setting a direction and identifying what needs to happen next. And I think that's when these comp plans have been successful. That it's identifying where does the city want to land in terms of its environmental leadership and taking advantage of natural resources instead of seeing them as a nice thing. They're actually a key element to making the city livable and improving quality of life. And so I think that's what makes these comp plan chapters really exciting, when you can have a dialogue of what you want as a city and identifying what you need to discuss, but not necessarily finishing up the details here. That's what the follow-on work is for.
Well, and the good news is the format is totally revamped. So there's not this necessary paragraph of verbiage. It's actually much easier to read now. And so, there's a certain amount of churn when you look at these old chapters, people had to write so much.
Oh, my God.
And
And you have
it
to
takes
read
a lot,
so
and then you
much.
have to read it, and really a lot of it could have been bullet points.
The students pointed that out. There's too much text.
Right. Yeah, and I thought their report, the Virginia Tech report, was really great in that they gave us really solid recommendations, and I was one of the people they interviewed, and I just think they did a really great job of questioning what we did and why we did it and how it could have been better, or, they were very nice. They said we did lots of good stuff too.
And our the changes in stormwater management have been huge.
Yes.
And with all, at that point, we'd only had 2 new, or maybe 1, and another one on the way of the mixed use. And the stormwater management involved with all the infrastructure for all of that, it's really helped out in various areas and things. So, I mean, that was just on the cusp of a lot of stuff that was happening. Because not much had happened before 2000.
Yeah, the ESC has been working hard on getting more information here about sustainable development, resilient development. So sustainable means that, we're using the place without destroying it for future generations, and resilient means we can cope with change as it happens. And Corey just organized a resilient development panel. When was it? February, my goodness,
Yeah,
it seems
yeah.
so recent. And we're doing a follow-up one with some help from Tim on energy and stormwater management on May the 24th. We just did a tour of Canal Park, which has some really remarkable stormwater facilities where they're capturing stormwater from adjacent buildings and using it to water the park, irrigate the park. So we can
School site,
think about these things. Yes, school site. We have there's a lot happening in the city, and if we plan for it, better, I think.
So Kate asks us here for recommended elements. So there's a couple that I was just going to point out. We mentioned climate change, which is obviously not there. It's going to be a challenge. It's carbon dioxide is invisible, and even if we completely eliminated our greenhouse gas emissions, it'll have 0 impact on global warming. And so trying to grasp those things and say, but still we have to do our share, it'll be a challenge, I think, to write that in an effective way. I would encourage that we, and I know that you know this, that we take on as much information from COG as possible. We pay them money, and they produce a lot of excellent work in many areas, including climate change. So, whereas places like Arlington spend a ton of money doing a community energy plan, we really don't need to do that. We've got a lot of information already available to us that I think if we craft it properly and put our spin on it and make it relevant to us, that it'll make it a lot less expensive and just as effective, I think, in the long run. I'd like to see a lot more information, or the introduction of information about supporting infrastructure for electric vehicles. And that will help us in multiple regards. One, clean our air, since they don't emit any particulates. Obviously, it'll help with the greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, I think there's an economic development aspect to it, because those people that have electric cars probably want to know that they've got a place to plug it in before they go and shop. So I think it'll be important for
it
all of those
would be
reasons.
very nice.
Yes. And you can say that with the...
It also makes it
You
quiet.
probably know where they are
Makes
now.
it quiet. I hadn't
I
thought about
know.
that. Noise pollution,
Noise
that's...
pollution is.
They're not really available within the city unless you live in the apartments and everything. They're not available down in the garages generally.
But I think that points out one of the things that's of value of a comprehensive plan is to the degree that we establish these as goals that the community wants, then it's going to be a lot easier to require of developers that they include these things. So it can be very helpful. I think we should add a section on the importance of energy efficient buildings. I think we saw that with Insight, where we got a good result, but it took a lot of effort because they didn't see that that was something that we necessarily wanted up front. So a lot of people had to negotiate for this at the back end, and I think if we lay out our vision and what we'd like to see right in our comprehensive plan, it'll be there for the development community to see. And we're not talking about trying to get out ahead of anything. I think if we could just match the best that Arlington and DC and Montgomery County and these places have already done and have been doing for years, we'll be in excellent shape. We talked about the need to add the concept of sustainability. It's kind of sort of there a little bit in the current plan, but really needs to be fleshed out. And then finally, I think I would just say that, and this may be part of your approach to say that we should be proactive as opposed to just defensive on the environment, is that really we can consider having a good environment as part of the city's brand. And that's something that attracts businesses and hopefully residents and the right kind of developers. We've seen other jurisdictions do that. We certainly see the large corporations, whether
Right.
it's Microsoft or Google or these places, that they are definitely picking out locations to go that where they can get the greenest energy. So
And Todd Hitt mentioned that in his
That's right.
speech at the Chamber,
that's right. So this is no longer just aspirational.
that he
This
saw
is-
the stuff we were doing. And aspirational.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so that's it.
Are there thoughts from other commissioners? There's, right, since we are on a short timeline, the more sort of popcorning of ideas we can do early, I think the better off this moves this position on the student, and not that this is the end of the research, but just part of the conversation. On page 34 of the student report in your packages, it has a summary list of recommendations for urban forestry, open space, water quality, air and climate, solid waste, green community, green buildings. Are there things that you all are particularly interested in seeing advance, or that as you're having conversations with community members, people are saying, why isn't the city doing more on X? What are the issues of the day that the city needs to respond to?
Well, I definitely think the way the student report breaks things out is more subject oriented. The current chapter is kind of like, it's just like things kind of overlap itself, and it's not like, so the stormwater is mentioned in there, and different things are mentioned, but they're kind of overlapping in the way they're presented. So I do like the way the student report's much more clear. So it's like, that there is something on climate, and there is something. Energy efficiency is a big issue. Power is a big issue, and I think that's a section, like there could be a section on that. I definitely think in the old section, there was a really big goal on education, and I think that should remain a major goal in the new one. Everything that we want to do, climate control, stormwater. I mean, we've got a handle on stormwater in development. I mean, not perfect, but just new developments are handling stormwater. But we all know the bulk of water that's not being handled is coming off of residences. It's the single family homes, and the overuse of grass in our city. It's not helping us. So it's just things like that. So education to me is like a really big issue. And energy efficiency reduction, the reuse part of our mantra, that's all about education. I just think that we haven't moved people past recycle yet. And so
Right.
those are
And that was moved, though, mainly through education, a lot through the kids.
well, right.
Yeah,
I mean,
that
and
moved it
that's
all.
like that's Operation Earthwatch's mantra: reduce, reuse, recycle. And the Operation Earthwatch worksheet, has more reuse and reduce in it than it did before, but I still think we just have an education gap there, and we have a lot of people without kids who aren't getting that message.
And of course, you're going to have to be working very closely with Tree Commission and everything also.
Oh,
A
absolutely.
canopy and, I mean, yeah.
Well, if you look at the schedule, though, there will of course be meetings with the ESC is going to talk about it at their next meeting, May the 17th. We'll address the ESC's views on the goals that should be in this chapter, and then the Tree Commission is the day before or a month later. Obviously, we have to look at the old chapter and see how we've gone against the goals. We have the students' assessment of that, but we need to review that and make sure they got it right. They had to go around and interview people and not necessarily get everything they need to know.
And I was looking at the whole tree list, specimen tree list that
Doesn't
is
need to
in
be
the
in
old-
there.
And heaven knows that's got to be changed, But that,
Actually, when I was an intern for the city, I bicycled around and checked on the specimen trees. So we do have an up-to-date map of the specimen trees,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
don't think it needs to be in this chapter of the comp plan.
Oh, I did want to say, I do think the one thing that was great in the old map, in the old version, was the number of maps. I'm not sure we need all of the same maps, but it's interesting, like, to see the division between trips run and 4 Mile Run, to understand that, where your water is going and why it is important. So I think, I'm not sure we need those exact maps, but I definitely think maps make a big difference in something like this.
Visual.
Yeah, this visual. And obviously, I care a lot about the old goal we had about protecting existing vegetation and native vegetation and trees and things like that. And so that's all in there. And I think we still want some version of that.
I think also, though, with the planning commission and our roles, is that, again, our zoning causes a lot of disruption on lots, when they tear down houses and clear cut.
I think the number Paul gave me was 4 acres a year.
Yeah, and so with the speaker, we have zoned so that people can build bigger and bigger houses. And that was the thing, with the coverage and all that kind of thing. And the use of our land for housing. It's kind of, we've set that up, that scenario of tear downs, and then build to the extreme, because I know that the new houses, I just have this feeling they are to the limits and over limits, just
So
looking
I'm
at
guessing
it
it's
all.
going to be hard to change our zoning much, but is there a way to create more incentives to keep trees?
Yeah, our current incentives are not working. So we used to have a much stricter tree ordinance, and when we had the stricter one, it worked very well. And then unfortunately, due to some decision making, we weakened our ordinance and we rewrote it. And so the current ordinance no longer incentivizes anyone. Because I've talked to developers and I've looked at their lot, and they've have like a cluster of trees at a far corner
Yeah,
of a
they can't-
trapezoid lot
yeah.
that they're not even going to build near. And you say to them, like, why don't you leave those in? If you do, you're not going to have to plant any trees at all. Like, there's enough coverage in those 3 large mature trees. And what they've said is that our incentive isn't strong enough to make them want to keep those trees. And the reason is, they said, if we get into the building of it, and then we suddenly determine we need one of those trees to go down, it's too expensive to have the equipment come back. Because what happens is a lot of people that build houses in our city are not real construction people. They don't. My father ran a construction company, and they had all their own equipment, so they could do what they need to do. Most of these guys don't own any equipment. They subcontract everything, and everything is rental. So they're not willing to pay the rental to bring that equipment back out. So our current incentives just are not. There's not enough financial oomph there for them to risk having to re-rent that equipment and leave the trees.
What are the current incentives?
It's
Like
Just
they
the
give
cost
you
of new trees. It's
they
just
give
the
you a
co-
high five.
It's just the cost of new trees.
but there's some that you have.
like the babyest tree, right? Like,
I know.
We need to meet the 20, whatever, the canopy.
You have to meet the canopy coverage, and then also if you leave a mature tree, the canopy coverage that you have to have is lessened.
If it's a big mature tree, it has a
So,
wide.
so like our feeling was like, we would rather you keep a mature tree than plant 5 little trees. And so we did try to incentivize, so you would have to plant less trees. But like I said, what you're hearing is when we have these companies who don't own any equipment and everything is
whatever, we
rental,
can
they
limit
just
that.
can't do
That's
it.
the fact of the.
No, I know, I'm just trying to say that's the reality of it. Is so they're,
DeMar signs up, it's
But I just think
you know,
that
it's all
our,
going.
well, I know, and so that's what I'm saying. I've talked to him, and this is why, and I understand why they're doing it. They don't want to take a financial hit
So what could
if
we
they have to
do?
take the tree down later.
What could we do?
I don't know, but there's got to be
Whatever
something.
we have to have an incentive that covers, that is valuable enough that they're okay thinking they might have to re-rent that equipment.
We could require that also. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to. We struggle
Oh.
with this, in Fairfax too, with by right development, as far as requiring people to keep mature trees, because it can a lot of times it can be done. But yeah, Melissa's, I think.
Can we do
is
it by
right.
state code? Because when they rewrote our tree ordinance, I believe we lost we had a grandfathered in tree ordinance that allowed us to make them keep trees.
Right.
And I believe we lost that grandfather ability now.
But
And
I
I don't
think-
think we can go back unless that's changed.
I'm not sure.
But I think
well,
our zoning has
I thought
done
we
us
could.
in.
Well, maybe there's been a change at the state level. You know, it's a
Recent zoning
whole.
change?
This is all
State
recent
decides.
design.
Right.
Or the increase in coverage,
Yeah, that was-
the increase in coverages on lots and everything.
When did that happen?
Melissa? when-
I will throw this out. I want to go back to something, Melissa, that you said, and I don't want to, I want to make sure I'm not stealing your words, but I do want to reemphasize some of the things you talked about nature and people's access to it and wanting a green place, and also talking about economic development and attracting places. And I think that was part of the conversation earlier, that for a long time in urban planning and city development, the idea was for sort of urbanization to sort of beat back nature. And you saw that in the undergrounding of streams, the clearing of lots, and now people are saying, well, I want some of that back. You see that in the preservation and restoration of floodplains. You see that in people bringing the urban tree canopy back into the commercial streets, that tree-lined streets are a major draw for economic activity. Nobody wants to walk in the baking sun, especially in July and August here in the Northern Virginia region. So the work that the city did to install mature canopy trees across Broad Street, the work that's going on now in South Washington Street to install trees, that's a big deal to connect the urban environment, the built environment, with a semi-natural environment. It's at least using natural things and making people reconnect those spaces. The work that Arlington is doing along 4 Mile Run to make that stream available for recreational use. Those are some of the things the city has talked about in the 4 Mile Run, restoration plan that the students did, the North Washington Street Small Area Plan, Parks for People, talking about these green spaces knitting together the city, trying to reclaim the Trips Run watershed. That what are the kinds of things that people want to do? What are the places that you do when you visit other places? Are those the same kinds of things you want to do here in Falls Church? And I think that's what comp plans are. That's the magic of comp plans, that you can establish a vision, because you're planning 20 years into the future, 50 years into the future. But then you're also talking about the toolbox. So the zoning doesn't quite work, or the subdivision ordinance doesn't quite work, or we need better incentives for these kinds of projects, or we need a way to bridge that gap to promote energy efficient buildings. That this is that mix that you have that opportunity to have in comp planning. What do we want to have? What is our aspiration as a city driving forward, being a leader in environmental planning? And what are the tools we need to get us there?
Yeah, that comes to mind, what I think what one of Melissa and my big peeves were people who wanted to do solar and cut down all the trees to do solar.
Mm.
Well, it's
What's
a
the
I
tension.
mission?
mean,
of
it's
those
just
things.
like, huh?
Well, it's a tension, definitely. One thing, you know, it's not by chance that the neighborhood tree program basically mostly puts trees in the city right away, because those trees shade the sidewalks where we have them, and shades the street where we don't, and because once they're in the city right away, we have control of their future. So in some ways, we counteract them removing the trees in the whole lot. If we have trees along the street, then we don't lose those trees. So, I mean, I think that's one thing to emphasize in there, that we do have, you know, it was in the old one, it should still be in there. The neighborhood tree program is a major way that we're going to keep our canopy, because we're putting in trees that we can keep.
Yeah, and the whole issue of community involvement was prominent in the old one, and I think we definitely want to carry that over to the new one. And we've just started up the Rain Smart program, which is
Right,
another
right.
kind of civic-led program. So, yeah, it's very important.
And we've
Small city.
daylighted.
Yeah.
As a city citizen, I would like to see the recycling bin, you know, it's great to have the wheels on it, but make the trash receptacle maybe a third of the size. And, because it's about packaging, and then you send a message, you know, you go to the store, you don't want all that cellophane around it and all that kind of stuff.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, I've heard that a certain student working with you is working on no plastic bags
Yes.
project.
Yes.
No
Got
plastic-
all filled in on that one.
Yeah, then we need no straws.
So I think we've talked about, I'm sorry.
No, okay.
I was going to say that of the questions Kate brought to the commission, one was his sort of topics of interest, and I think that the group has talked about that. The other thing is just to take a look at the timeline and make sure that this is something the group thinks is reasonable, and that's on the last page of the memo. With the kickoff with the Planning Commission here in May 2018, then taking it through some of the background work, getting to that first community meeting in July before that summer break, working with the boards and commissions in the fall, coming back around through the PC, the Planning Commission, and then looking for an early 2019 action by both Planning Commission and Council. That would be consistent with the timeline for the other chapters.
Good luck, Kate.
No, it's
But
not
looking
just
from
me.
it, your point of view, ouch.
But you have to do the whip.
Because it's a big area. I mean, it's a big chapter,
Yeah.
The environment is
which
everywhere.
is very passionate with different groups.
I'm telling you, it's catchy.
It would be,
Oh.
it'd be interesting at the Operation Earthwatch anniversary party if we could have some kind of display about this, that we're updating it and maybe give people an email to send comments in, because you'll have a bunch of environmentally minded people there. So that would be a good, outreach.
In the October timeframe, it says, second community meeting, evaluation of proposals. What proposals are we talking about evaluating here?
Well, within the, once we've got the first draft, that does establish goals and priorities. And the question is, once you've written down some goals and priorities, people will need to look at them and say, I don't think that's important.
I
or
think they mean
do
the
think that-
proposed-
that
Proposed
should be-
changes.
The
yeah.
proposed changes and action items and stuff.
Okay.
One thing that's good, the geology is not going to change.
And we definitely don't need as much information in
And
there.
man, that was long. I'm reading all this stuff and
It was
saying,
interesting,
nice
though.
to know.
It's kind of the information you don't want to lose it, but wow, it's not appropriate where it was being
Could
used.
be
That's
an
what I wanted to
attachment.
connect to, that
It could be an attachment.
the maps that you were talking
Right.
about being so important to educating people
I was
about
wondering
what's
what you were
going on
trying
in
to
the
connect to.
environment. The fact that the city has watersheds, I don't know that people even get educated in grade school about what is a watershed.
Oh,
and
yes,
if I
they do.
drop a piece of water
Yes,
here
they do.
versus, I don't know
Fourth
if
grade-
it's a
The
piece
fourth
of
graders
water,
do it,
but
TJ. I know
Yes, they do.
There is a
are we
big,
telling enough people about
Yes.
that?
well, I think it's on a regional scale. I think you ask any fourth grader about the Chesapeake Bay watershed, they'll
Right.
know. But they won't really think about it in terms of the city, which is interesting. That one map shows the dividing line right through the city.
Right,
the two
right.
street. That's cool. But
We should keep that stuff. I mean, I think it's important to have some foundational.
Yeah.
What is the environment here? You got to start with the natural
The line is
resources
actually
that
in
were
my
here
front
first.
yard.
When the land was in its somewhat virgin
a
state,
couple water out.
and then
Depends on which side of
look
the
at
house
it
I
now.
pour
I think
water
it's
out.
helpful for people to realize, even the geology stuff. I think it's helpful for people to realize some of the soils, the geology. I mean,
I think
kind of
it's also
foundational
a,
stuff.
a great way to have a conversation with people when you're talking to them. Talk about landmarks, places, parks, lakes. You mentioned Lake Barcroft, and you watch people. You can see the mental calculus going on. They don't know what it is or where it is. People have become so used to naming things by the roads or the streets they're by that they don't really think about landmarks and environment and places
Well, the
and
map that
boundaries and
has all
gateways.
those named hills.
Right, the hills, right.
Yeah, all of our hills in Falls Church.
I'm
All
not sure where they
300
get those
feet of
names
it.
from. Center Hill that they said, which is over like up the street here. I don't know. I never heard that one before.
Yeah.
But it's on the
Right.
map.
Something else about zoning and tear downs that just upsets me greatly. You tear down an old house, they take all the good soil away.
Yeah.
Where does that good soil go?
Throw it in the river.
And then it's backfilled with crap. And you can't grow anything on it. And it's just horrible.
Really back, I thought they used the
All those
dirt that
hills
they
so
dug
great.
out. I don't think
Not
they
all those
buy new
hills so great
dirt.
around here. I don't know. It depends.
Usually they
It's
pile it
okay,
to the
Lindy,
side.
soils only take millions of years.
I
to
know,
form.
but it really upsets me because, had a new house go in and man, they took all that beautiful soil away and then what's over there now is just horrible.
It's all the clay they dug out of the ground.
Yeah, that's it. So that all comes up and is up on the top because they've disturbed it all. So that's what they have. Then you got to have more runoff and everything else as a result of it. And and I can go out in my backyard. My God, topsoil is.
That's what leaf mulch is for.
I think
But-
this also gets to the education issue. One of the interesting things that I know you two are aware of was how the recycling effort was supported by block captains. People,
I was going to
throughout
bring
the
that up. We don't
community.
have that anymore.
Well, it's something that the ESC has been talking about.
Yeah, we used to
wanna
have very active
say
block
something about it, Cory?
captains.
Well, some were better than others.
Yeah, but, yeah.
Okay.
I don't have much to say other than it seems like it was a very valuable resource, and we feel pretty strongly about reviving it. So, in fact, we're thinking at this point tentatively about possibly launching it, or at least asking for a sign-up sheet at the community meeting in July, just to see if people who are there might be interested.
It also served as this distribution of information.
Yeah, they would do door hangers, and then when we had the paper newsletter, they would actually hand deliver them. And then some of them would have meetings. We had meetings about stormwater when we placed all the stormwater signs saying that this water goes to the Chesapeake Bay.
Isn't somebody else doing that now? There's a Eagle Scout
Replacing
going to
them.
do that. Signs on all the drains, on all the stormwater.
The drains in the bay now.
There is still a lot of them. We actually had a scout just do some stencils
Right, that's.
around
but
the
this
city,
is-
but they're temporary.
Yeah.
They'll appear when it rains and disappear
Right.
within
Oh,
about.
yeah,
And
You saw
then
it?
also all the lawn service people who blow all their debris down the storm drains.
Yeah, she's very unhappy.
What
that's-
about when the gas company dug up your street?
They should
Oh,
be.
no, we got a new street. No, but that's irresponsible. You can just see them just taking their blowers and putting it all down the storm drains.
Which they shouldn't be doing. It causes problems for us.
Yes.
And
Keep
it's not
saying,
good.
you know how much money that costs? Okay.
We provide the feedback. I mean, there wasn't much about the schedule other than good luck.
The schedule to me seems doable from a community standpoint and mostly up to whether or not staff.
Sounds
can-
like
has
an
the
awful
time to-
short timeline to me.
We've been doing them in this timeline, though. I mean, Mr. Stoddard got one done almost. Like you, I think you
City
took
that
the whole
gets
12
things
months, though,
done?
didn't you?
Is that the-
Yes,
Yeah.
and I had a pretty sophisticated team when I did that too. So it's you
It
know,
would
these
be
things
sad
can
if you
hit,
take 12 months. He did.
these things can hit hiccups. So I think that's why we always, as staff, tries to aim for February, because you've still got a March slip date. I think the real goal is to avoid April.
Yeah.
April's a very busy month with the budget, and so the goal is, can you come out of those that winter holiday season essentially ready for action?
As much as I would like to say, oh, I need 2-3 years to do this, if this is a plan that's supposed to be updated every 5 years,
Yeah.
taking 9 months is about as much as you can do.
And I think the 05 was, I don't know when the other one was done beforehand, but it was really, really a long time before that.
We get bogged down. But the last time we tried to do it is one big comprehensive plan, and the meetings were just endless.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Do we want
I don't know if you want to. The chair of the ESC is interested.
Yeah.
in
public hearing?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to pose a public hearing, sorry.
Hi.
This feels very official.
It's just easier to hear, really.
I
Being
appreciate that.
recorded.
We need the nice name cards and the microphones, Kate. Thanks. This has been a great conversation. It's been really nice to listen to all of you. And I think we've talked about a lot of issues that some folks in the ESC have started talking about informally also. So I guess I have a question for you, Paul, and for you, the Planning Commission. And that's a question of scope. When you start to look at how our neighbors have addressed environmental issues in their comprehensive plans, there's quite a range of solutions. So Arlington has an 11-chapter comprehensive plan, and something like 7 of the chapters address environmental issues. So they have a community energy plan, they've got a stormwater plan, they've got natural resources plans, they've got a transportation plan that incorporates environmental issues. They've got an affordable housing plan that incorporates some environmental goals as well, which is really interesting. If you look at Fairfax County, they have 1 chapter that covers a number of things. And then you look at DC, and they've got a sustainability plan that goes beyond some of the issues that we've talked about today and gets into social sustainability and equity as well. So when we think about environment, it touches everything. When we think about sustainability and we incorporate the social and economic pillars, that tends to get pretty broad. So just bringing it back to Falls Church, Tim has already mentioned electric vehicles, and that, touches on our, transportation plan. We've talked about green spaces. I know our Parks for People plan includes, a reference to green infrastructure where possible, I think. So I guess the question is, as we go along this process and get a sense of what's important for the community, when we start to see topics that touch on other elements of the comprehensive plan, what is the best approach that you would recommend? Is it putting down a marker that, we see some opportunities in transportation for more EV, more shared vehicles? I mean, how are you guys thinking about kind of the scope of this chapter and how it affects other parts of the comprehensive plan?
I hadn't thought about it, honestly.
I think
don't know.
it's some things are going to naturally overlap in that, and then I think we also have interjected sustainability and environmental issues into the other chapters,
Right.
because they naturally belong there as well. So I don't think it's a problem to have it in more than one place, but I think that the scope of it may be a little different, So I think in this chapter maybe we'll talk more about educating people about some of the things about energy efficiency, where maybe in other chapters we talk about a goal that's different. But I think the more places we have goals that are related in between the chapters, the more likely those goals are going to get done. Also for staff, that means they could check maybe 2 boxes. That might make them happy.
Well, I can say that there is commonly overlap in planning documents, and that's not a surprise. That urban planning has never been very clean cut, right? We talked about housing planning across jurisdictional boundaries, that those jurisdictional boundaries are somewhat artificial to economics, that in the same way, chapter boundaries are artificial to subject areas. So the transportation plan talked about great streets, and then the Parks for People plan talked about green streets. Well, those things obviously overlap. The Parks for People plan also talked about reclaiming the floodplains, and that's something that when we had the speaker here from the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust, they were talking about. And there are economic impacts and economic attraction to these things. I think that is always a challenge with planning exercises, that at some point you've got to stop and get something, you've got to get action on something. And some of this is a strategy of planting your flag early and often. So if the goal is to get through a 9-month planning exercise, how much can you get done in 9 months, and can you set yourself up for positive actions for the next 4 years, so that you're spending 9 months setting direction, and then you're spending 4.25 months implementing. The presentation at the joint ESC and CACT meeting about mobility for all modes, that mobility for all modes chapter was really about setting a vision and establishing the next steps, and can the natural resources, or the environmental chapter, however it's being phrased or framed, achieve the same goals. And I think to what Commissioner Teets said, what are the things that this provides a unique perspective on? Everything is going to come at the city from its own perspective. So what are the things that are uniquely environment? So if it's electric vehicles, are we talking about affordability? Are we talking about greenhouse gas emissions? Are we talking about reduced energy use? What are those aspects that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, you can take something like smart growth, which is certainly going to be in Chapter 4, discussed there pretty extensively, but we can also mention it in Chapter 5, because there are greenhouse gas reduction benefits to smart growth. So
I'm less worried about the overlap than I am about the inconsistencies. That's what I really want to see if we can spot. And if we say something that these are principles and things we care about in the environmental chapter, they have to permeate the rest of the plan. And we need to weed out those things then that aren't consistent, whether they're parking or transportation or housing, zoning, whatever it is. That's going to be, I think, more of a challenge than anything else, because then you're setting 2 different visions and there's no guidance for the community.
And using the same vocabulary.
I
Like
think that-
even in your statement, you use 2 terms that are interchangeable, but people might not know it's the same thing. Green, it's,
They're not exactly the same thing.
Well, and I think you talked about inconsistencies in the plan, and external consistency is so important to a planning document. And I think what we've been, what we as planning staff, and now this is incorporating a larger group, which I'm really excited about, the idea that the comp plan is really everybody's plan, and having other departments become authors of the chapters, I think you're going to see more consistency in implementation because more people have a stake in seeing the comprehensive plan come to fruition. And I think the approach has been sort of a steamroller approach that you work on this chapter and you iron out the pieces that aren't quite working, and you know there are some older chapters out of date, and that's okay. That it's always going to be a process of updating, building on what was done before, and maybe adjusting as you go. And so the last chapter you update, the most out-of-date chapter will have the most inconsistencies. But it's also the one that when you update it has the tallest shoulders to build on and set a new vision. That we were just talking about great streets as a community when Mobility for All Modes got adopted, and now it's sort of worked its way into the vernacular. People know what a great street is. And so it became that much easier to talk about it, apply for grant dollars, and actually start building some.
Right. Well, thank you all very much.
Yeah. Good
Really
luck on
appreciate
this. And we'll see you a couple times here in the next 9 months.
I think
You're
I'll
on.
need the good luck. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Okay, next item is the April 16th minutes. Do we have any comments on those?
They were short.
Yeah.
The chair has requested that they be short.
Yeah,
The
Approved.
chair continues
I
to
agree
request
with
that.
them.
It looks fine to me.
I've got some changes I was going to recommend, but I don't have them here.
We could defer to the next meeting,
Are they
or I would do it
substantive, or are they just like grammatical, or what do you think?
I
Is
thought
it?
they needed a little.
I'm happy to defer. This is not a big issue here.
Move to defer the minutes to the next meeting.
Second.
All right.
All right.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All right. We're going to defer these so Mr. Stevens can provide his input. Okay. We are up to the planning director's report. No, that's not true. I'm sorry. We're up to the planning commission reports. Mr. Stevens, do you have something you wanted to talk to us about? You sent me an email.
I don't. I gave the report on the attending the Fairfax County Planning Commission effort for the West Falls Church, which I can elaborate if anybody has any questions, but otherwise I just wrote it up in that report and shared it.
How about briefly, just to summarize it so that it's on the record? I don't know that everybody's got the public's not privy to that email, so
Okay, well,
just briefly, just so that.
This was relevant to the WMATA, the Metro's proposal to put development on their property at the West Falls Church Metro Station. The initial component of that in Fairfax County, I presume it's the same thing here, is to update the comprehensive plan. So in this case, the county forms a task group made up of residents who live near the affected property, and they provide an initial recommendation to the Planning Commission as to whether or not the issue should be studied. So it's a pretty limited recommendation, and they had a very long discussion to arrive at their decision.
Gonna happen.
And perhaps the most interesting part of the whole evening was the speaker from WMATA who gave, at least for me, it was the first time I had heard what their thoughts and plans and rationale was for the development that they would like to see there. And in fact, I think we should invite Nina, is her first name, to address our group for sure here, but perhaps other groups in the city would benefit from an overview explanation as well. Anyway, this group did vote to recommend to the Planning Commission that they allocate resources to pursue further study of this issue. So The Planning Commission is going to meet on June 21, and I may try to go and just speak. It will be open to the public, so an opportunity for
You
us.
should go. I did that once. It was fun.
I recall, that was on the Mount Daniel.
Yeah.
Yes, very
I'm
good job.
fascinated by our tiny little planning commission.
Right, different scale.
It's a different scale, that's right. So, is that
Perfect.
suffice?
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you for attending and writing that up for everybody. And
Did we
now,
get it?
now
Did-
reporting
Did
on
we
it.
get it?
He sent an email.
I got it, for sure.
Yeah, I got
think- Okay. Well, it
Actually,
wasn't
Brent
just me.
Krasner had, was the one that raised that issue to us, so
Right,
thank
and
you.
at the last minute, I was on child
I don't know
care
if I
duty.
got it.
But I appreciate you, Tim, going and writing such a thorough report. I did talk with some county staff, that is working on that working on that amendment, and Tim's summary of the evening was very accurate. And yes, the next step will be at the Planning Commission in June, where there'll be an opportunity to talk, and the Planning Commission will take up, also, they'll have to decide whether or not they want to make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors. They may wind up deferring it and taking more time, depending on if there's consensus or not. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Are there any other planning commission reports?
Just briefly, both for the EDA and for the Parks and Rec, both Big Chimneys and the downtown park came in over budget. And so now they're looking at perhaps writing on a Fairfax County rider on one of their contracts to get it costed out. You know, we've done that a few cases and see if it's been value engineered quite a bit, both projects. So that probably won't be in for a couple more months. So it's still out there riding. They're really working very rapidly on new parking spots up on the north side of Park Avenue and down and working on, the biggest thing is on Maple to restripe it and to get parking spots there, but they have to get rid of the stripe in the middle of the road because they've got the space, but not the stripe makes it impossible. So they're really working on getting more and more parking spaces in that whole area.
Okay. Anything else?
I went to the library board, I don't know what it's called, the library group?
Yeah,
You know what's-
board, I think is right.
Library Board of
Trustees.
Library board,
Trustees.
library trustee.
Yeah.
We looked at some plans for the renovation of the library. Very impressive inside conversation mostly. There's questions about where to put the entrance. Put it on the corner of Park in Virginia or right on Park.
Right,
I don't, and it's mostly about flow inside the library. There doesn't seem to be much talk about how it looks outside. I mean, there's architectural drawings and things like that. No real connection to the great streets or anything else like that. So I think the commission would probably want to weigh in on how it looks on the outside and how it reflects the neighborhood and things like that. They got the inside stuff covered. They know scientifically what's good for library circulation, but we probably should pay attention to how it looks on the outside.
Absolutely.
Just to build on that point, some of the specific things that planning staff has been looking at in the designs that have been coming around, the staff corridors. One, keeping an active frontage across all of Park Avenue, so avoiding a blank wall. Is it possible to create an outdoor seating space so that there's some sense of activity along Park Avenue? Thinking about, are we designing a tighter intersection at Virginia and Park Avenue? Is there a relationship between the entrance to the library and the entrance to Cherry Hill Park? Is there a way so that when people are approaching from the west, that the municipal campus has a sense of entry, that
Right.
you've got the great park in the city's downtown, you've got the great library in the city's downtown? Do they have open and welcoming designs that talk to each other across the
Makes
street?
sense.
And I think the concept of having the entrance on the corner kind of related to the park makes sense. A lot of people do that on Saturday, farmers market, park, library, or some variation. The only thing I'm concerned about is when they add on the Virginia side, the building is, it's going to be pretty lumen over that sidewalk, and we're going to lose a lot of vegetation based on the plans the
Yeah.
drawings I saw. So if we do that, the architecture on that side is going to be really, really important. Or it's just going to be a very sad little block to be walking on with this thing looming over you.
Yeah,
And the sidewalk there's narrow too.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. Thinking back to the conversation about the natural resources chapter, the environment chapter, the idea of introducing green elements and organic elements not as an afterthought, but as a critical piece of the design and the infrastructure. Not that the city's going to necessarily follow this model, but I remember being at the Freer Sackler Gallery in D.C. A few months ago and thinking about that central courtyard, and they've got these lovely arched gateways that break the space between indoor and outdoor, and within those they've framed understory canopy trees that mimic the size and scale of the archway so that your indoor space moves through these glass windows, through these beautiful stone arches, and then into these trees that are about the same size. And so you've got this wonderful blending, and you're not quite sure whether you're inside or outside. You're really both at the same time. And can the library do the same thing if they've got these beautiful brick archways that are reminiscent of what the city's designing at the community center and city hall? Can the trees continue that story? And this is what great streets are all about, that idea that the street, the public spaces, as well as the buildings, the private spaces, blend together as one experience, so that when you're going from City Hall to Cherry Hill to the library, you've never really left that municipal campus. You've been in it through the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, the Planning Commission certainly has a role in looking at
Oh, yeah.
the site design.
That was not part of the conversation.
Well, I think also the AAB can be
With
a
their
strong
budget.
group, thinking about not just architecture, but landscape architecture. And that's what great spaces are about, the design, so that people have a consistent feel or a consistent experience.
Mr. Chair, I do have a question. I don't know if the Planning Commission has had plans of anything coming from the commission for the $15 million grant that's being worked on for the high school site. That's coming up, what, on the 10th? The meeting is
Public hearing is this Thursday.
10th.
So I think what's being referenced here.
Yeah,
is
what are we talking about? I'm
The
sorry.
city submitted 2 applications to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority for consideration in the NBTA 6-year funding program. The first, the city's second priority application was a $17 million application for multimodal transportation in the North Washington planning opportunity area. The city's top priority, and I think that's what's being referenced here, was an approximately $15 million application to support multimodal transportation in the West Falls Church area. There has been a lot of public outreach, a lot of groups, including the EDA, the Rec and Parks Advisory Board, the CACT are submitting letters of support. There's been a large amount of outreach at the farmers market and other community groups. So I think the Planning Commission, if it's of interest, could take an action here to authorize a commission member to prepare a letter of support and submit
I know
it.
it's a short timeline, but, I do think that's money that if we get that, then it doesn't come out of the money that's going to be needed to
Be to
do
improve the
the,
periphery
yeah.
of the site, which will, of course, add value to it in terms of the lease negotiations.
Is the action for the commission to choose the priority of Route 7 over 29, or?
No, I think the action, and I apologize for not including this in the commission's agenda, but I think the action would be to authorize 1 or 2 members to prepare comments and submit comments.
On both projects?
It could be on both projects, but most of the community outreach has been on the West Falls Church
Right.
project. It appears that the city is likely to win 1 application, but not both. And so I think what's been happening is rallying support for that 1 application to make sure where this focus is right now, the West Falls Church area, that's the one that receives the regional funding support.
What if there's also the WNOD
The-
project?
Correct. So just an update on the WNOD application. Nova Parks, the regional park group, did submit 2 applications, one to Transportation Alternatives Program, and they did receive, or they're likely to receive, an award in June of about $250,000. They also submitted an application for, I think, somewhere between $1 and $4 million for the NVTA, and what I understand is that probably is not going to land on the staff recommended list. So that project may not be fully supported through grant funding, so they'll be looking for other sources.
Do we want to authorize someone to make those comments on this grant by West Falls Church? Does anyone want to write comments?
Does it kind of go without saying that we support it? I mean, I guess it can't hurt, but doesn't it kind of go without saying that we would probably support it since we're the planning commission?
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Absolutely.
It'd be more noteworthy if we didn't support it.
Yeah, yes, that's true. And
But if we-
particularly
but I
because
guess it doesn't hurt to write
it's
another letter.
student, it's
other
safety
groups
for
have done it.
students and for
Yeah.
all the traffic signals and everything that are going to be.
Well, I'm okay with writing comments, but I need some documentation to read so that I can reference it
Letty
properly.
had a whole list of things.
Sure. What
Yeah.
I'd be happy to put people in touch with Carrie Odinino, who's been the city staff member leading this effort, and she has worked with other boards and commissions to
Right.
prepare letters.
Like if she wants to email me and just tell me what she's looking for, like what do they need?
And I know that Letty had a lot of communication going out.
I mean, it's simple enough to put together a couple paragraphs supporting it.
Well, I'm happy to sign anything. I don't have.
If you guys want to do that, I could draft something and have you sign it, and we could send it around by email and decide. We'll send it to Miss G so that we don't break the rules and let her send it around, and we could do it as a group. But
Well, I'm supportive of it, so if it helps that I would sign it versus anybody else, I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
The
on
chair-
behalf of the
And
planning
you can do it on
commission.
behalf of us.
Yeah.
I'm okay
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah, I think from open meeting law, I think the important thing is to take the action tonight so that if Russ signs the letter, he really is speaking for the entire commission. Otherwise,
Yep.
he's
Get
speaking
the letter here
for himself.
from
Oh.
Carrie, so
I'll
do.
I'll send it to
you
you.
send it to me, okay?
You need a
Because
vote? Is
it's
that
just
what
like
you're
you
saying?
have to have the
Okay.
references.
An action recognizing that you're
This has
speaking
it
for the
all
group.
there.
Depends what you say.
Well,
Pending the text, we have, pending the text that is going to be in support of this grant, do we want to make a motion to authorize me to sign something on
Absolutely.
behalf of?
I so move.
Second,
Support.
okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Great. Happy to sign it.
You know, unfortunately, we didn't have a meeting earlier, in this month, or at the end of last month.
When does it have to be signed by?
Thursday is the
Thursday.
public hearing, so
Okay.
I think we should probably be submitting no later than Wednesday.
Of this
yeah.
week.
So Tim's sending me an email. He has one of the emails that has the stuff in it. I'm just thinking we just need something like we just need 3 paragraphs.
Grant is
'Cause no
great.
one
We
wants
like
to
it.
read more than 3 paragraphs.
Good, do it, please.
We're
Very
the
good.
plan commission. We really
Transportation,
believe in
money,
good
good.
planning. This project is great because of this.
All right, well-
Please give us the money.
Not 30
Also
minutes,
with the
so-
aspect of whether Ramada's going to do anything
Punch it
further
right
up the
up.
road, my gosh.
Thank you.
Free money, good.
It's absolutely necessary
Please
to
give it to us
redo
for this
that
project,
whole.
thank you.
Well, remember, these are taxes you've already paid, so it's not free.
That was a grant.
It is.
Grants on money we've
it's,
already paid.
Grants funded by regional taxes,
Well,
so,
but it's only a portion we paid,
correct.
so we still come out ahead.
Uh,
Don't we?
Yep.
No?
Every dollar we get is better than
We
no
don't get it,
dollar.
somebody's getting it, so.
That's what I'm saying, right.
We know we don't get our state taxes back.
Well, I'm happy
federal.
to sign it. I am on business travel starting early tomorrow morning, but I'll be back in time. I just don't have time to write it between now and then.
Okay.
So if
I'll write something tomorrow night and send it to Miss G and she can send it around, or
Okay.
if I have time I'll write it during work. I'll just skip work for a while. I'll write it during lunchtime.
Anybody else on planning commission reports? My own on the campus coordinating committee, they met, I guess it was last week, and not this, not 2 days or 3 days ago, but the previous week, and I guess they hired a bunch of new like
Project director.
project directors or director firms to help with the school planning. They are expecting responses to the RFP like any day now. I don't have the exact date for the schools. Our very own Tim Stevens is going to be on the committee to bring it down from 3 to 1, I believe.
Yeah.
And on the school, I'm sorry, the 10 acres that we are
Yep.
hearing, we got 6 proposals. I am on that down select committee. We meet on Thursday. I don't know how far we're taking it down. It's sort of the kickoff meeting, and we'll have like 2 or a few weeks, 2.5 weeks to review these 6 proposals. And I don't know if it's the same as the school one where we were trying to get it down to 3, or if we're trying to get to another number. I actually just don't know. But so on our, in front of our microphones is the list of the applicants. And I'll know more about it on Thursday. It's not a public hearing at all, but that kickoff is 3:30 or something like that, 3:30. But I can report more about it a little bit after that point.
There are minutes, I understand, but it's hard to, Becky sent them out to the EDA members, and, but there didn't seem to be any notes on the last one.
Yeah. Well, it was a big group, but most of the 30 people here happen to represent the firms that were going to be.
He's been sending out the minutes usually ahead of the next meeting, so I suspect they would come.
Yeah, I actually don't even know when the next meeting is. I left like 10 minutes early, and we're banging up against Memorial Day, so I don't know when the next one is, but I'll find out soon enough. Not much to report, just we're on pace. You were there.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
And
it's-
not much to add.
That's right.
No, unless I'm forgetting something.
No,
Okay, let's move to the next item. The planning director's report, and you have monopolized the whole agenda here. Look at all these items.
I am trying to keep the commission informed and aware.
Let me see.
So some of these things are simply, all these things are information updates, that's why they're in the report. Let me just walk through a couple of these things. The first attachment, the Planning Commission's work plan, green bars,
I've
this
got
should be
that.
nothing new. This was finalized during the Planning Commission's
Yeah, there it is,
advance.
right there.
I am trying to keep this in all of your agendas and all your reports as the lead item of what is the commission working on this calendar/fiscal year. So there have been no changes at this point. Things are moving along as planned.
Great.
Let's see. Second, Mobility for All Modes status update. This is a presentation that was given at a joint meeting of the Environmental Sustainability Council and the Citizens Advisory Committee on Transportation. And the presentation highlights a lot of the great work that's been done in support of the Mobility for All Modes plan. I just want to touch on the highlights.
You feel better?
If you have the versions in front of you, on page 15 is where it starts about successes of the planning document. So Mobility for All Modes was adopted in 2014, and since then, when you look at the short-term actions, the policies and projects, most of them have had either completion or substantial completion. Updating the neighborhood traffic calming program, participating in the Route 7 alternatives analysis, working on a shuttle bus feasibility study, updating traffic signal master plan, updating automobile parking requirements, something the group is talking about. And then projects that got delivered. Roosevelt Street is under construction now. Bicycle wayfinding got installed. Bus shelters got installed. The projects in the South Washington Street small area plan are under construction. And
What
even
was the bridge master plan? Just sorry, because was it related to the fact that we're rebuilding our bridges? Because we are rebuilding one right now.
Very slowly.
Very
Yeah, well, we had a problem, you know.
there's a contractor hiccup. The
Saturday though, I assume.
Yeah.
oh, good.
Well, somebody that was there, I don't know, he was stealing stuff, I don't know. But
It was a dude.
Somebody there.
Trying to steal the bridge. The at least once it's put together. The idea was the idea of a master plan is setting a vision and the steps you need to take to get there. So the city's major infrastructure, when you think about right-of-way and streets is the bridges, the traffic signals, and the paving itself. And so the idea was come up with a cataloging of what's most in need of repair, and also taking a step back and thinking that the city's right-of-way infrastructure is not just for moving cars. It's about increasing access to businesses, access for people who have mobility issues, design, improving quality of life through the city's right-of-way. It's
Okay.
20% of the city's land area. What can you
I
do
just
with
didn't
it?
remember that. It seemed like we already knew we were going to fix that one, then Sharrow, then Oak Street. But, and I don't even know if we actually talk about all the pedestrian bridges, because we have tons of those too, but.
Yeah, I forget the count on the city's number of bridges, but it's somewhere in the teens or 20s.
Yeah, you don't realize how
Because I would
many.
think it would be like, not zero.
Yeah, the city has really hidden a lot of its bridges by
Right,
its
right.
design.
They're
And
part of
that's
the
something
street.
that's right, trying to change with the Van Buren Bridge project. Can you put something on it, whether it's a crossing or a landmark or a special material on the rail?
Well, that one you knew
Toll.
was a bridge because you could see the water. But Oak Street, you can't really tell.
No, you can't.
No, and so I think when you
It's
see the
just part of the
South
road
Oak Street
until the
Bridge,
water comes over.
it's going to try and mimic the design of Van Buren, and so hopefully everyone likes the design on Van Buren.
I like bridges that don't fall down when you try to walk on them.
Well, that's important. You talk about the bridge master plan. I think there is state of good repair money that's available from the state, and I think of all the bridges in the Northern Virginia region, there were something like 6 that were in this relatively low category of structural stability, and 4 of them were in Falls Church, which is pretty remarkable when you
Oh.
think about the size of the region and the size of the city. So
Really?
this is just a piece of infrastructure that the city has not given as much attention to as it could over the last year.
I didn't realize we had them.
Oh, and bus shelters are rocking. They look really great.
Rockin'.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm glad to get that feedback.
Well,
a lot of
at our condo association meeting, we had a real struggle because,
yes.
well, we won't mean
Not
say who it
everyone thinks
was.
they're rocking.
No, they were like, no, we don't want bus shelters near our windows. And so we had to fight. We had a massive condo fight for a year and a half to get those bus shelters agreement. But anyway, they look much better. They look so
They
well
look-
where they're
they're nice,
located.
they're nice.
And it has cut down on the amount of trash actually that we had in our flower beds. So I thought that was really nice.
That was a big push with the bus shelter master plan. All the things that go into bus shelters, street cans, trash and recycling were one of the things that got worked into the standard footprint. That until then, some of the bus stops just had plastic bags tied around the poles.
Right.
Because riders knew they needed something. But can you do something more permanent and certainly more attractive?
It's made a difference already.
Great. Great.
Yeah.
I'm glad for that feedback.
Yeah, and I see people using them a lot, so that's nice.
Yeah, I think, shelters are very important to people using the buses. Having a comfortable place to wait for the bus makes a big difference. That I know when I ride the bus into the city, the first leg of my trip is standing on the side of Lee Highway with heavy car and truck traffic driving by. That's not very pleasant. When I do my return trip, I'm starting in a city shelter. And even if I have to wait the same amount of time, my stress level is so much different because instead of standing in that small grass buffer between the curb and the sidewalk, I'm behind the street, I'm in a permanent place, I have a place to put my bag, I don't have to worry about someone coming up behind me because I've got a shelter wall behind me. It's just a psychologically much more comfortable
And
experience.
the wind.
The wind is blocked. I don't have to worry about the rain.
And they look good.
Yeah.
They do look good.
And you can tell there's a difference between when you drive in from Fairfax, you can just tell the difference when you drive in, that these are different bus shelters.
And that was part of it, the design aesthetic. Those went to the Planning Commission intentionally.
But Brett, you guys need prettier shelters now.
Oh yeah, I'll talk to FCDOT about
How about
that.
$1 million bus
Different
stop?
department.
Can do that. They've
We do
had
have some
them.
good
They
shelters, actually.
exist.
We have some.
You do. Actually, there are some nice ones, but Route 7 just doesn't have
Massage
any
and
good
your
ones.
$1 million
Yeah.
So anyway, this was a presentation that was given, and it was really just to tout the success of the city. And when I say the city, I mean the elected officials, the appointed officials, the citizenry, staff, about collectively moving forward on this vision of more sustainable transportation and a different, an increase in mode choice, transportation mode choice.
Thanks for sharing. There was some good data in here too about how long it took to travel on buses and stuff like that, which was good to see.
And then, let's see, also included in the director's report, a couple of items on fair housing. And these were, did the comp plan Anyway, there were two items in here in the packet. One was a joint letter from 2016 that was issued by the Department of HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the U.S. Department of Justice. And it was a letter in question and answer form about what is the intersection between federal fair housing law and local planning laws. I think oftentimes when people think about fair housing, the first thing that comes to mind is what can landlords do or not do in terms of renting apartments. But a lot of fair housing also relates to what can local jurisdictions do and not do when it comes to zoning and land use regulations.
And when they talk about the apartments and everything, you got to be very careful in what you say and how you say it.
And I think it's not just about what is fair housing law about and what's legal and what's not, but some of this goes back to Commissioner earlier in the evening mentioned New Jersey and fair share laws. A lot of that grows out of what is the purpose of zoning, and the idea is to promote things that are good at the state level. And so really these state powers, these zoning powers, should not be used at the local level to exclude populations. And so a lot of what's in fair housing, and this joint letter is talking about that. The other thing that was in the packet was a highlight of state enabling legislation on comprehensive plans in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it talked about the requirement for each locality in its comprehensive plan to plan for an appropriate amount of affordable housing given the context of the region. And so these are provided as information items, and certainly they're relevant not only for the update to the housing chapter, which will kick off hopefully soon, but also for conversations about individual development projects and proposals.
We're just getting this now for information.
Yes, it's for information purposes
Do
only.
you know how much of this is still in effect? It's dated 2016, November 2016, and like the affirmatively furthering fair housing, all that stuff has been. It's not being implemented, correct?
You're talking about the letter? I'll have to take a look at, this was what I could find with a relatively quick search. But certainly I think as we kick off the housing chapter, that might be a time to do,
I'm afraid some of this has been thrown overboard.
yeah, so that might be the time to do some more research.
Okay.
Also,
Yeah, I thought there was one more thing.
let's see, Marshall Street, this is provided for information purposes. I think there was a question that came in.
I asked about it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so what's included here is, what's in the director's report is a brief summary of what's going on. That the development, and I checked it out, I drove by it today. What's going on is that there was a single structure, a single-family
right.
house. And what's under construction now is 2 single-family houses.
But did it need a subdivision?
No. So,
Single house straddling 2 lots.
Okay.
and both of the lots were
Okay.
already conforming in size, so it was not a split lot issue, nor was a subdivision requirement.
That was my
so
big
it's-
question.
Can you, speaking of that little neck of the woods, there's a fence that's right against the street, one lot down from that is 6 feet tall, right at the curb.
Oh, yeah.
I asked John Boyle about that like a year ago. He told me he was going to look into it. Never happened. That fence has to be non-conforming.
It is.
It
I don't
is.
know how it's there. I think John Boyle's got to issue them a violation on that. It's egregious how that fence is right out the street, 6 feet tall. It's the only one on that whole stretch looking like that. It's against city ordinances. I don't know how it goes.
Tell me how you get that cleared up, because I got a neighbor and my wife gets so mad about it. I'm like,
Well, I mean, that's what John Boyle, his department, or him, his
He's
department.
supposed to do that.
He's supposed to do that. I know his department is him, so, and I know he has some assistants.
That's
you know,
true.
who help him, but
Don't hold your breath.
I asked him about it, and it's still there. And so I just don't know what the story is with that. It's so egregious. I don't know. Maybe the neighbors who live right around there don't have a problem. No one called or said anything
Very
about it. but
unattractive.
It's
Well,
yeah, and it's against their ordinance. So I mean, I think someone should look into that. And
The neighbors were upset about this,
Yeah.
the 2 houses being built too.
It's one lot down from where we're talking about on West
Yeah,
West Marshall.
it is.
So,
on the
I know
same
exactly
side
what
of
you're
the
talking
street.
about, because when it
Yeah.
went up, I was like, how is this legal?
I don't know how it is. It's been there for like over a year now, and so the
I
more
sent
time
an
that goes
email
by,
at the time, but
yeah.
nothing happened.
So yeah, Paul, if you will follow up with Mr. Boyle on that.
I've got that written down. I will follow up
That
with
would
him.
be super duper.
Well, did you see it when you were driving by? Did you notice the fence? Because it's
I
pretty
did.
visible.
I did not notice. I was
Focus
trying to
on the
get
house.
Yeah, I was taking a look
Yeah.
at the.
It's like one
ongoing
lot to the
development.
south. It's kind of weird because there's a house and there's like another house a little bit behind it onto another lot, and it's almost like
It's strange looking.
the person must treat it like their
if you
side
go
yard,
on
but
that
it
street,
doesn't
there's a-
matter.
it's
It's
literally
still
6
right up at the
feet
street line.
tall.
It's clearly the front yard
Oh, Marshall,
from zoning purposes. So
near
there's no way
TJ.
it's kosher
Sure.
to use
So
a
you know how
technical
TJ
term.
has Seton Lane,
Right, so
and there's a bunch
I'll
that
I'll
goes
pass it
to
along to
29
John.
and cross over.
Let us know
So
what
Marshall's
happened,
one at once.
the status next time.
And then 2 items that I
Thank
did-
you for that information.
All right, you're welcome. I'm glad I could help. Let's see, there was 2 items that were not included in the memo, but I did want to update the commission on. First, hard copies, were these passed out?
Yes.
Yes.
These were the list of respondents to Phase 1 of the West Falls Church RFP. Obviously, the proposals themselves can't be distributed, but the proposers could. It's 6 respondent teams, and from everyone I've talked to, I think they're very satisfied with the number of respondents, as well as the quality of the names included in the respondent teams. So I think, Russ, you're going to have your work cut out for you in terms of narrowing down the proposals.
I know I do.
And then the other thing, this was distributed by email, and I had phone calls with each of you. This is the text amendment to the B2 ordinance.
14 pages worth.
Yes, it's lengthy. Well, it's the combination of the staff
Yeah.
report as well as the staff analysis that goes into the zoning amendment and the zoning amendment itself. As a zoning amendment, this will have to come to the planning commission, and so we can schedule. Council is talking about this in a work session tonight. They may have already done so, and just to discuss a little bit about where this is a proposed text amendment for the B2 district. And the idea is to, if the thought is to rezone the land around West Falls Church B2, this would be a text amendment to support the kind of development that the city has been talking about. So allowing taller buildings, again by special exception, and then also a entitlement process that is designed to keep pace with the RFP process.
We talked about a 2-step process back in January. Is anything different here from the 2-step process that was discussed back then?
I expect it's similar. I cannot remember the exact conversation in January, but it would still be a 2-step process. That the special exception process would have 2 council votes as part of it. The first would be special exception entitlement, and that would be timed to take place in May of 2019. And the reason for May 2019 is that lines up with the RFP process and the signing of the comprehensive agreement. That is what allows, if you read through the text amendment, that's what allows the combining of what can be built along with the transfer of the land, so that this avoids that concern that a developer gets control of the land and then builds something by right that was not intended. That first step can lock those 2 things together. The second step is again council action, and this would be a special exception site plan. That this would be more similar to the Arlington model, where the Arlington board votes on both the entitlements and the site plan at the same time. In that capacity, or in that scenario, the Planning Commission has an advisory role, and I think council would be looking very heavily for the expertise of the Planning Commission, because the council's not used to looking at site plans and the level of detail that the Planning Commission is.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about before.
I still haven't determined. I read through the document and I have it on my phone, but because I didn't have time to print it today. But
You read it there.
I can read it anyway. So I'm still not sure how advantageous it is to do the site plan in this manner, because so much of what's in a site plan doesn't really relate as much to the special exception kind of issues. It's totally different issues. And one of the reasons, and anyway, I'm just trying to figure out why we think, what's the value of doing it this way, changing the way we normally do site plans. Because the issues that we look at site plan don't really affect the development per se. It's really just looking more at, how it affects citizens, traffic flow and fire safety and stuff like that.
Is it just a change to give city council more comfort in moving forward quickly?
Maybe, but I wonder if it will move forward more quickly. Because site plans, for them, for when we get to site plan, they have to have all their engineering stuff
No,
done.
not that
Otherwise, you
part. I
can't.
mean, the special exception part forward. I think,
it's the whole idea. That's exactly it.
yeah, I think the point is that we want city council to be able to feel confident that they can move the special exception forward quicker than normal, because then they'll have some sort of control over site plan. I'm with you, I'm not sure that it really makes much sense, but if it makes city council more comfortable, then I don't have any problem with it.
I don't have any problem with it either, but it just seems to me that we're going to go through a lot of time to make this
Hold on.
zoning change.
Live updates from the Washington.
House.
What's
Overtime.
Overtime?
Caps one.
Yay!
Whoa,
Sorry.
really?
Continue.
Okay. No, no.
That
I,
was real time update.
well, I told Mr. Stoddard the same thing. I mean, I'm not like, hey, we can't do it this way. This is awful. But I was kind of like, we're going to spend a lot of time and staff time writing this and changing things and making votes, really just to move how site plan's done in a way that doesn't really change how site plan's done. Except that
it's
the people
just
voting
the-
on it don't understand anything about site plan.
Which is why I think this is going to be fine. They're
Yeah.
going to rely on, we're still going to provide a recommendation, and it'll
That was
still
my
be.
question to Paul, too.
Well, no, we still do a recommendation, but it's just, like I said, I can't say like, hey, this is really awful, but I also think that we're just gonna spend a lot of time on something that really isn't gonna change the project much. Except
Perhaps.
that this one group is gonna have to figure out what site plan means. And,
When we do our recommendation on the special exception site plan, will we still have a public hearing? Or will there still be
That
an
was my
opportunity
question,
for a
too.
public hearing?
Yes.
About public hearings.
Yes, so that's still included, is that the planning commission would still have to hold a public hearing, that it would be in fact, it's called out that the planning commission would have to hold a public hearing before
Yeah, I
making its
wasn't sure
recommendation.
from this process whether
Right.
we were kind of eliminating one public hearing.
yeah, my only other concern with it was, we have had this ability to do a special exception and site plan at the same time for a while now, and we've not had one developer take us up on it. And so I asked, like, we were told that we should add this because developers wanted to move faster, because that's what Arlington does, you should do it. So we made the change to allow for it. And then, so I've asked developers, why haven't you taken advantage of this? We were told this is what you wanted. And most of them said they really wanted to get the special exception done before they got into the nitty gritty of the site plan. So I guess the other question I would have is, I think we need to make sure that, you know, the people that are going to be hopefully our partners on this are okay with this.
Well, that's my question, is whether or not, how developers will respond. And then, Paul, we talked about some, and then you tried to think through it. Because the timing here is going to be special exception, and then years go by before site plan. And a lot of stuff can change. So the question is a developer going to go through that special exception process that's going to have some money involved with it? Is the whole point.
Yeah.
And then be at the mercy of city council for site plan 2 years later. I mean, I don't know if they are, great, but
It just like spreads out everything. I'm just like, I don't know.
I don't think to be at the mercy of us, but at the mercy of city council.
The worst.
Well, I guess when I was reading it, I didn't realize it was going to be that much time in between. I thought the whole
because
point
they-
was to move it faster.
Well, but the faster part is the special exception part. We're not going to
Okay.
build the high school
Right, the entitlement.
until we have one of these guys on the hook for
Right.
confidence.
Oh, okay. Well, I
Yeah.
misunderstood. When we had our conversation, I misunderstood. I thought we were going to try to do them faster together. But no, we're just going to make the change in the voting, but it's still 2 years apart. So again, and there's probably maybe a quite a different council at that point. Who knows?
Oh yeah, that's why my concern is only just with if it'll negatively impact the developers. But
Yeah.
I don't know that there's. I mean, they would still be on the hook for us with site plan years later. So it's not like they have to have a bit of a leap of faith. Now, of course, we're going to want the thing to be built when the time comes, because then we're not just getting some little bit of money up front. They got to build it first to get the rest of the money and to get the tax revenue. So it's going
Right,
to
right.
be motivated to get it done.
Well, let me just say, now that I know there's there's most likely a 2-year gap, I really don't understand what the point of this is. But, I don't think it hurts anything.
I think it's speed on the front end so that the entitlement piece of it is not being slowed down.
No, I'm just talking about the site plan vote being, the way site plan is being done, being changed. I really just don't understand it. I don't think it hurts anything, but I just don't understand what the purpose is.
I think it's so that the process will just take too long, although if you're trying to do it in a normal special exception kind of way, to meet these deadlines, and the idea is to make sure this is not the reason that this project is slowed down.
Using Insight as an example, that took 3.5 years.
Okay, but I mean, just saying the site plan component doesn't.
Yeah, but I
Does
think,
it have an
I don't think
effect
it's because
in here?
city council feels like they will maintain some control over that long gap between
Well-
special exception and site plan.
Well, it
whereas-
should be made clear to them that at site plan, there isn't substantial changes that you really can make. I mean, you can turn the whole project down at that point by not giving them a site plan, but you can't fix anything at site plan, like really fix
Fix
it.
where like the garbage goes.
Right, you can fix
Yeah.
that, or you can say,
Yeah, that
hey,
kinda stuff.
the water pipe going into your building isn't gonna have enough water pressure for fire trucks. I mean, that's the kind of things we've changed at site plan. So do they I just wanna make sure, I would just say the council needs to recognize that they are not gonna be able to substantially change this project.
they're not gonna-
They can
right.
say
We
no,
want them
or
to
they
feel like
can
have
fix
some
the water
control at
pipe.
end, so they'll approve something.
And they're gonna come to us for the recommendation
And
anyway.
Paul, something else that
We should totally like.
came,
You're on your own, guys.
It's in your court, I'm sorry.
that came up in reading this that Melissa and I were thinking
this thing
about.
through.
It's line 364. I know we talked about it quite a bit, but we don't know if it got into code that no single-story buildings were allowed by right anymore. We don't know if it ever got into code.
I was looking for that in the city zoning ordinance, I guess about a month ago, and if I remember correctly, it was a limitation on the B2 district, that you had to be at least 2 stories.
And I think what we were talking about was probably, maybe we needed an other B
In other
district.
Bs, in the B1
Yeah.
or the B3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have anything to do with this because of the the ratio of square footage. I mean, there's
Right.
going to be no single stories
No,
up
so
there.
that's
but,
not an issue
But
there.
reading that and saying, didn't that change? And it came up once before. But sometimes we talk about it and it doesn't get approved by council. Or it didn't get that far or something other like that.
Yeah, I think the fact that 364 is calling out that single-story development can be allowed by special exception, it's obviously modifying what's there by right.
Okay. Okay. Distant memory things.
Okay. I think that's it, right?
No game 7?
That's everything I had.
All right. Anyone else wants to discuss? All right. We're adjourned.